the trees, alternative virtual reality.
All right. So I'm here in VRChat in Treehouse in the shade with Kent by. And Kent, I feel that you don't really need any introduction in the VR space. I mean, your podcast, Voices of VR, is really, for those of you who may not know, perhaps the most expansive resource for anyone wishing to learn more about VR, what its potential implications is for business, social relations, and just general humanity. So thank you for the work that you're doing with this podcast. And I'm looking forward to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. You know, there's not a lot of other philosophically driven VR folks, and so I'm really excited to have this chat with you, because I think that for me is a big catalyst for what I do. And just a little bit of the context of that is that, you know, I think I started the podcast really trying to learn about the principles of experiential design, and that over time, you know, part of the challenge is that, like, if I watch experiences at, say, like a film festival, a lot of those experiences aren't necessarily available for people to watch, but there's still value for understanding what I went through and trying to describe my own experience, but also trying to break down what kind of like new things that they're doing in terms of experiential design, which means that I end up having to take a little bit more of a critical theory approach of trying to both find the language to talk about experience, but also to describe it in a way that people who didn't have that experience could be able to understand why it's important, because there's a, you know, let's say a cohort of people who are watching these experiences that may be taking that insight, and in the absence of having any sort of documentation that is made available in a sort of media format for people to consume and understand, then it becomes harder for the medium to, I guess, evolve in different ways. So there's this process that I feel like I've been in this conversation with the larger VR industry of both watching the medium as it's evolving, but also coming up with a language to talk about it. And I think that's a big part of VR, is that it's concretizing different ways of modulating our consciousness in order for us to be able to come up with the language to talk about our own direct phenomenological experiences. And it's through that coming up with that language that we're able to really dive into the nuances of our own direct experiences. And I feel like that's a big part of what VR does, is that it's like trying to create an objective way of having a subjective experience, having people go through that, and then find ways to be able to connect to what's unique to your experience and what's kind of universal amongst everybody as they have that experience. So I feel like it's, you know, phenomenology is not an area that, and subjectivity is something that hasn't been as explored within the realm of science, just because there is so many different variables. But at least within VR, you're able to have like a standard, you know, VR headset and mostly the same experience. And then from there, you're able to kind of break down the different aspects of your own direct experience. So I see, like, in the long term, VR is this process of, in some ways, experiential design is coming up with a theory of consciousness. And consciousness is, you know, in the realm of philosophy, like one of the biggest open questions, both from a scientific perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective. And that we're able to maybe cut out a lot of the, you know, contextual dimensions of subjectivity and trying to maybe isolate different aspects of our experience, and to be able to come up with language to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, that's really important, and that should also be mentioned. I mean, you travel a lot, or at least traveled to these different festivals to try out the experiences that, I mean, you can't get at Steam VR or whatever. And often these really, those that are really trying to experiment with experience and the capabilities that the VR can offer, they're not necessarily developers selling experiences in the same way. So what is the most, what's the most interesting thing that you've seen at one of these, film festivals or whatever we call them? And again, you would have to use words to describe this, which is sort of inherently complicated, right? How do you sort of account for this experience?
well, just to, I want to set a little bit of context as to that question, and then I'll dive into the specific question for, the specific experiences. But yeah, for the first, I'd say I started the podcast at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference on like May 19th and 20th, 2014. So it's, just past 7 years now that I've been doing it, since I think we're talking here on the 24th. So 7 years of going to probably anywhere from 60 to 80 different in real life gatherings. And I guess what my coverage was different than maybe some other, other outlets or YouTube channels, is that I was really interested in going to these events and seeing what was emerging from the community. And there's a lot of things that you could do when you're in real life that you couldn't do with, say, if you only owned like a VR headset from like the Vive or Index or Oculus Quest, right? So there's only so much limited ways in which that you can distribute these different experimental pieces of content. I think it's worth kind of going into both my motivation, which was to kind of see what's next. Where is this going? Where we're at now and where are we going? And then also to kind of have a framework for how the medium evolves, which is that, there's a theorist named Simon Wardley, and he talks about both the technology diffusion, but also the, I guess, the evolution of the technology. So the diffusion is the degree to which that the technology gets out into the culture, and the evolution is the ways in which that the technology itself goes from the DK1 to DK2, CV1 to then the first iteration, second iteration. So each evolutionary aspect of this technology, as it is kind of developing, has a certain amount of market penetration. And then there's different phases that Simon Wardley identifies as the technology goes through. The first phase is just a prototype idea. Like the academic theory of VR was proved out in the 60s with Alfred Sutherland and Tom Burness. And, to a certain extent, there was the Sensorama, Morton Hellig, that was developing these abilities to kind of hack our sensory experiences. And then once it goes from that prototype philosophical, like kind of academic idea, then at some point it gets into the enterprise market where there's these custom bespoke applications that are developed that then are, I guess, each time you create an experience, it has to be kind of handcrafted. You can kind of think about like that. And, in the early, like the late 80s and early 90s, that's when the enterprise VR and Jaron Lanier and all these $1 million silicon graphic machines came about. And that was the phase at which that it was kind of penetrating into these academic institutions, NASA, different medical applications and military training applications. And so from there, you have a market that's developing that is in the enterprise, but you need like millions of dollars in order to have any aspect of the technology. And then at some point, you reach the consumer phase. And the consumer phase is when it kind of goes mass market and anybody can just go and buy a headset and you get pretty much a consistent experience, and you have mass market distribution for experiences that are out there. And that's sort of what happened with VR, starting with Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive and all of this sort of ecosystem of the modern resurgence of VR, is you have this kind of consumer development of the technology, but some of the experiences are still in that enterprise custom bespoke application because it's not at a mass market enough for developers to just create those experiences. And eventually we'll get to this sort of mass ubiquity phase where, it's arguable that we haven't really even reached that with the iPhone and iOS, because there's still some differences that are distinctly different between iOS and Android. And, it's arguable that we've gotten there sort of with PCs. You can buy a GPU and, there's some differences between AMD and NVIDIA that is proprietary, but more or less you could sort of meet the certain specs. You can think about it like once something reaches the commodity phase, it's like getting electricity, or you're buying like cloud services on the web, or you're buying gasoline. There's not a lot of differences once it gets to the commodity phase. But this sort of productized phase, I mean, that's currently what's happening between this lawsuit between Epic and versus Epic Games versus Apple, is because Apple has created some sort of arbitrary gates that is preventing it from getting into the commodity phase, because they want to sort of maintain this closed walled garden aspect within their ecosystem. And it's sort of an open question as to whether or not we'll be always within this productized phase of closed walled garden within XR and the future of computing. And I think it's a big reason why Tim Sweeney and Epic wants to sue Apple to be able to kind of break it up to reach this commodity phase. so that there isn't, so much, a competition. So I just want to sort of lay out that as a framework of kind of the prototype of an idea versus the enterprise versus the consumer phase versus the mass ubiquity. And in order to know where the future of VR is going, you have to really look at these types of enterprise applications, or let's say like the film festivals, where there you can start to do things that you can't do if you only have the stock VR headsets. So that's a big reason why I've had to travel, is because there's a lot of these experiences that I just couldn't have using my hardware at home. And because I'm so interested in where things are going, then I end up going to things like the IEEE VR conference, where you see different prototype demos, or to going to SIGGRAPH, where you get to see some of these more experimental technologies and the future of where things are going from the hardware perspective, and foveated rendering, or varifocal displays or stuff like that. But in terms of the content and storytelling, you see a lot of the biggest innovations that are coming from like Sundance and Tribeca and South by Southwest and the Venice Film Festival and IDFA Doc Lab and all these regional festivals, where content creators are not only creating experiences that are pushing the limits of what you can already do with like commercial off-the-shelf technology, but also adding other dimensions of specific experiences that use haptic or smell or other things like that. So that's sort of the context. You asked specifically. I'm going to pause there before I go into your second question, if you have any other, sort of thoughts that you wanted to share.
Yeah, no, I can just play on that. I've not been able to go to a lot of these conferences myself, but I went to the Kai conference a few years back, like the conference on human factors in computing, and they had this thing that you definitely couldn't try at home, because they had this swing that you were sitting on, and they were manipulating the extent to which, I mean, they figured that you could increase sort of in virtual reality how much you were swinging in the virtual swing, and you didn't get motion sick as long as it was in the same axis. And that's also like this crazy experience that it basically felt that you were flying at but anyways, it sounds really interesting to be able to check out all these things.
Yeah, and in terms of like some of the experiences that I've seen that stick out, for me, what I'm really interested in is the kind of the theory of experiential design. What's a framework for us to be able to understand the different qualities of presence, and then as we're designing, what are the different trade-offs that you use. So I tend to look at things through this lens of the quality of presence, which is like the different types of presence, of like active presence, mental and social presence, embodied presence, and emotional presence. So like Beat Saber is a good example of a game that I think hits a lot of these different dimensions of presence. You have active presence, and so you're actually playing a game. There's gameplay mechanics. You have a sense of embodied presence, where you're actually moving your body to actually play, and there's a puzzle element here, which is the kind of the mental friction, where you kind of have to like figure out how to solve the puzzle, but it's an embodied puzzle that you're using your body to solve. But the thing with Beat Saber is that in some ways, in order to get to the higher levels of solving the puzzle, it's actually, you have to kind of train your body to be able to move in certain ways, so that you have a situational awareness where you're understanding what's coming, but you also have to like have the visceral response with your body for moving in the right way. And there's sort of a gameplay element where if you kind of miss too many, then you fail, and then you have to kind of restart over. And then the emotional presence is this degree in which the music is like really immersing us into this experience. And so I think part of the reason why a game like Beat Saber is so successful is because it really hits all the different qualities of presence that really show the affordances of the medium of VR. So you have the mental and social presence of solving the puzzle. You have the active presence of it's a fun game. You have the embodied presence, where you really viscerally feel like you have a sense of your body is there, and that these lightsabers are representing of your body, kind of evoking this virtual body ownership illusion. But also this sense of place presence or the place illusion, as Mel Slater calls it, where you feel like you're actually present in the place, and you feel just emotionally immersed and engaged into the experience. So that's like the quality of presence. You have like the context of the experience, and so whether it's a game or you're going in, when I ask people the ultimate potential of VR, then they usually answer into like, oh well, the ultimate potential is in education, or it's in entertainment, or it's in telepresence, or it's in expressing of your identity, or finding new ways of using the virtual space for economic exchange, or being able to connect with your family or your business partners, or dealing with death or grieving, or higher education and training. So there's all these different contexts that VR is really strong for. And then there's the character of experience and the story of the experience. And so I'll talk about the character of the experience by talking about one of my favorite experiences that I saw called the Collider, which was I saw at ITFA Doc Lab and then at Tribeca, ITFA at 2018 in Amsterdam, and then in Tribeca in New York City in 2019. This is an experience where you have two people that are going into this kind of immersive theater type of experience where one person gets unveiled into VR and the other person is outside of VR. Before you go in, you're listening to these headphones, and they ask you to kind of remember a memory that you've gone through. And one person is recalling a memory where they've had someone have power over them, and then the other person has a memory where they have power over somebody else. So there's an asymmetry here of power that they're exploring, but also they're exploring sort of the character of boundaries. Because one person is going into VR and they can't see what the other person is in VR, and you're kind of manipulating and controlling this other person. And so to what degree are you going to transcend the boundaries of this sort of asymmetrical power relationship when someone's in VR and someone's outside of VR? And they're really playing with that in a really interesting way. Like they'll have like a feather or other things where you can kind of really mess with somebody. And I had a chance to actually do this experience twice and go through both sides. And I found that there was aspects of my own experience of boundaries and power that were being explored through an experience like this. I think that's where the power of VR is really powerful, is that if you can put people through a artificial context, but in that artificial context, you're asking someone to make a decision. And, Robert McKee has a quote that says that, stories are all about watching characters who are being put under pressure and having to make decisions. And based upon what decisions they make, it's a part of revealing a part of their own essential character. And the more intense the pressure and the more closer that whatever choices they make is revealing a deep part of their own character. So as we go into these arbitrary contexts, we're making these choices and we're trying to decide, okay, are we making these choices just that's completely contextually dependent? Like this is just an arbitrary context and it's not really reflective of who I am. I'm only sort of killing these zombies because, it's a conceit of the game and I wouldn't really be, killing entities that are real. Or there could be decisions that you're making that are actually reflecting a part of your true essential character. And a part of what I think we're doing in these VR experiences is putting ourselves in these contrived situations and making these choices and seeing if there is some consistency across these different experiences to learn more about who we are and why we're here. So I think that's like the experiences that really stand out for me are the ones that really can achieve that. Can they allow them to give me some deep reflective aspects of my true own essential character? And then, the last point I'd just say is that there's the story that's unfolding and the different types of storytelling and how there's different, interactive, experiences. And so like the Meta Movie Project is one that sticks out in terms of I'm immersed as a character and I feel like I'm a part of this world. And there's like 3 immersive theater actors who are completely a part of this experience with me as an individual, being able to kind of react to the character that I'm embodying, but also to go through this adventure through the story world that, I feel like I actually have some agency and the choices that I'm making actually is impacting the story in some capacity. And so the types of experiences that stand out for me are the ones that make innovations on any of these different quality, context, character, or story. Like context, a good example is the Book of Distance, which is now available. You can watch it, but it's about Japanese internment within Canada, and it tells the story of this family's journey from Japan and immigrating into Canada, and they go through this process of going through Japanese internment and dealing with all the bureaucracy. And you are embodied into different phases of this experience, like on the farm helping them out, and dealing with different aspects of the police coming and going to prison and actually trying to get a restart after you're out. And so by being embodied in the virtual reality, it actually gives you a deeper connection to the context that they had to go through as they're going through their story. And then, there's tons of different innovations when it comes to the haptics or smells and ways that that's been used. There's an experience called We Live in an Ocean of Air that was at the Saatchi Gallery in United Kingdom that was done by Marshmallow Laser Feast that used like smells and just an amazing point cloud representation of these trees, and being able to see through nature and get a sense of the life cycle of how things kind of flow. And yeah, I mean, the different types of experiences that stand out are ones that are making sort of revealing to me unique affordances to what the medium are and what it's able to do. And I think in some ways, that's what I've been trying to do in the podcast, is have these experiences, and then for every experience I go through, trying to point out, okay, what's new, what's novel, what's interesting about what they're doing here, and what are the principles and the affordances of the medium that could be extrapolated and applied to any other domain of people working in VR.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I also think that being immersed in these stories, I mean, it becomes different than watching a movie or reading a book because of the participation and the immersion. And there is also, I mean, like you said, is it just conditioned by whatever context you're in, but you're bringing something to the experience. So if you are embodying an avatar, then that is changing you, but you're also bringing yourself into it. So it's, you sort of get to experience an altered subjectivity in a way that you're still yourself, but you're placed, you're situated in relation to this world and can make reflective stances based on your experiences there. So that sounded like a really interesting project, the one where one was in VR and one was not.
Yeah, I took a look at some of your paper that you wrote about postphenomenology, and I don't understand it fully yet, and I think there's probably a lot of overlap between what has drawn me towards, say, Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy, because I think that there's a lot of different ways in which that we are relational beings, that we're in relationship to the world around us, and that one of the things that Whitehead came up with in the process of reality that has other precedents, but this concept of Meriology, which is the whole part structures. And so there's ways in which that you're a part, an individual, but you're also a part of a larger system, an ecosystem. And so, Whitehead was really trying to figure out the math structure to really explore the ways in which that entities can be both an individual and a part. And he ended up having what he called like both the philosophy of organism. So thinking about things more in terms of biological organisms and these entities that have these pattern relationships, but that, all ecosystems and organisms both have entities that are a part of those wholes, but also are within themselves a larger part of a larger whole. So it's sort of like a fractally nested dimension of wholes and parts. And that's philosophically called Meriology. And, Whitehead is trying to kind of, in some ways, say that the basis of reality are these kind of Meriological math structures that are wholes and parts that are scale-free and dependent at the smallest scales up to the largest scale. So you can look at quantum mechanics and start to say, rather than trying to have what Western philosophy has, which is substance metaphysics, saying that the basis of reality are these physical concrete objects, that it's moving into process relational metaphysics, saying that the ultimate nature of reality are these processes that are unfolding that have patterns of energy that are in relationship to each other. And that whether or not you're looking at the smallest scale of quantum mechanics, whether or not you're looking at human relationships, or whether you're looking at the largest scale of galaxies in the universe and the multiverse potentially, that all of them are patterns of energy that are in relationship with each other, and that are in processes that are in dynamic flux, that are unfolding, that are not static concrete objects, but that they're an unfolding process. And so, as I read different aspects of postphenomenology, I can't help but to notice that there's certainly a lot of this sort of shift towards a relational ontologies, rather than sort of the concrete static ontologies, that even our language that we're using has subject predicate, in that the languages kind of reflect a sort of static concrete objects of that kind of have the substance metaphysics presuppositions. But there's other languages of, say, like Chinese languages or a lot of indigenous languages that actually are trying to escape that kind of concretized way of modeling reality and more into the process relational way. And so that's why, for me, I am very much a fan of the process philosophy because it does have this turn towards the process relational ontology that has other ways of expressing it. And if the post-phenomenology is just kind of like a relational turn, then I feel like, well, how deep does this go in terms of the metaphysics? Because I feel like Whitehead's process relational ontology actually gets deeper into the metaphysical realities of really looking at the nature of reality as process and relationship. And for me, it just, there's a way in which Whitehead puts our direct embodied experiences, or our qualitative experiences, as being primary, and having our experience as being sort of the fundamental basis of reality, rather than, sort of the physical substances in these objects. And as we move into the virtual world, I feel like the process relational philosophy is a better metaphysical grounding to be able to go into this future, because the virtual versus the real becomes less of a distinct difference. It's more of, what are our relationships to the world around us, and how can a simulated reality potentially give us new insight into our existing relations, whether or not they're in real life or in the physical mediated experience. It doesn't really matter in terms of, at the end of the day, it becomes our relationships to the world around us and the entities around us. So yeah, I'm still a little confused as to what the post-phenomenological frame gives that the process relational frame doesn't already give me.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually heard of Whitehead, I think the first time in an Alan Watts talk on Buddhism or Chinese philosophy, with the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, sort of pinpointing exactly what you're saying with the language and the way that it's like substance. I mean, every verb has to have a noun and so on, and like the it in "it is raining," sort of having these meaningless sentences. And I think in relation to what post-phenomenology brings that process philosophy does not, I'm really not sure. All I know is that it's very focused on the technologies as mediators. So it's a philosophy of technology that looks at that impact concretely. So maybe in terms of the like fully grounded metaphysics, that process philosophy runs a bit deeper. I mean, in terms of like the mathematical structure and going into physics and quantum physics and so on. I guess post-phenomenology is perhaps limiting itself a bit in that it's phenomenology, and sort of takes to describe human experience. But then again, process philosophy has this link. So how is this link between, it takes its sort of, does it start from human experience, or is it just that it's, it's this embodied viewpoint, or how does it relate to experience in process philosophy when it's still so concerned with the physics, even down to this very fine level?
Well, I think so. Just for a little bit of a context, I feel like process philosophy was created, it has lots of different threads going back to like Heraclitus or Schelling, and there's different process relational philosophers with Gutierrez, is that the phenomenologist. Oh no, it's actually the Gutierrez collaborated with, who is the other guy that worked with him, who's the his name's escaping me at the moment, unfortunately. But you also have like Bergson and Teilhard de Chardin. You have these kind of process relational thinkers that have had different aspects of trying to make this turn towards this immanence or being that is going beyond sort of the concrete object and substance metaphysics, sort of the alternative to these. And probably even to a lot of the German idealists, and also like there's a way in which that Hegel, in his Hegelian philosophy of the dialectic of the thesis and the antithesis, and then you're trying to get into the the synthesis of those two, where Ken Wilber would talk about the transcend and include. So you have different perspectives where you're trying to combine two polar opposites, but there's certain aspects that are mutually exclusive. And so each of the perspectives have to, what Jung would call sort of sitting in the tension of the opposites, from this alchemical principle of having these two opposite things in dialectic with each other, but you need to collaborate and be open-minded enough to see the the positive aspects of each of those perspectives, but yet the limitations of those, and then together you sort of synthesize into a new synthesis, and that becomes the new thesis that then has sort of another antithesis at some point. And I had there's a little clip from Agnes Callard, who's a philosopher at the University of Chicago, and she was talking about the Socratic method and whether or not there was a deeper insight into the Socratic method. And she has this 5-minute video that I've just been like, when I watched it, I just like incepted me. I just immediately got it, and I've been almost like sending it out so many different times on Twitter and thinking about it. But her point is that when it comes to epistemology and knowledge, that there's a big debate around what is knowledge. Knowledge is trying to believe truths but avoid falsehoods. But she makes the argument that those are actually two completely separate algorithms, that you can't actually do the same thing, do both of those things at the same time, especially as a single individual. And what you actually need to do is have a deliberative process across a community that has one person who's really advocating for a theory and or idea, and people who are really the skeptics or the critics who are really putting it to the test. And it's through the peer review process of science that this actually happens, where you say, here's the science, here's my research, and here's what we found. You put it to the peer review process, and then you see what you missed, or if there's critiques to that. And then if once it goes through the peer review process and you're able to publish it, then people try to replicate it to ensure that what you found is actually a piece of knowledge that you can believe. But at the heart of that is this sort of dialectical process that, Agnes Callard compares to, say, as a metaphor, justice. And, part of justice is to acquit the innocent and to prosecute the guilty. But that in order to do that, you have two teams, two set of lawyers, that one is completely responsible for trying to, take the interest of the defense and protect the innocent. But then the prosecution is trying to prosecute the guilty, and that's a separate team, and that they're in collaboration with each other through this deliberative process of our justice system in a courtroom with the judge and the jury that is in collaboration towards justice. But that one side or the other can't achieve the justice without that deliberative process, which is what I think of as this mutually exclusive dialectic that has to happen through these two teams, whether it's through justice or through the production of knowledge, where there's those who believe, you have to have the will to believe, which is, William James, and then Clifford would have, the perspective of being the skeptic of, trying to avoid believing falsehoods. And if you prioritize avoiding falsehoods, then you may never believe what you may, the actual truths that you need to, in some sense, make an inductive leap into believing something is there in order to go out and search for evidence. And so I see this as a larger kind of like, dialectical process between these two entities that at the heart of it is a process. And so that's why I get back into this process philosophy, because you have to sort of, in the essence, have this deliberative process where you have the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And so, you have Western analytic tradition, and then you have the continental tradition, and in some ways those are engaged in some sort of dialectic, but not really, because they're not really in dialogue with each other, not really growing. They're sort of bifurcated in some sense. And in some ways, process philosophy is this sort of other things that's, I think, in some ways trying to maybe facilitate that dialectical process. But even within, say, modernism and postmodernism and then metamodernism, there's this dialectical process that's already happening within the philosophical tradition over time. But even like postphenomenology is yet another dialectic of like, okay, now you're putting yourself in antithesis to the phenomenological tradition, but yet, like it's what are the two dimensions of the thesis and the antithesis that's really being explored in the postphenomenology? That's something that I don't quite understand yet. And what I have read it just looks like sort of a process relational approach where it's trying to break down all the different relational dynamics. And then if you're going to do that, why not just use process philosophy? So, and why not just move into Whitehead? Because that seems like he's already doing all that. So, I mean, maybe there's some people who are, experts that really be able to explore that. But I feel like, part of the challenge of someone like Whitehead is that he's very difficult to read as a source material, and that you have to, see how it's been digested by others. And, part of the challenge is that he's a mathematician. And so he has a very distinct way of seeing the limitations of our written language, and he's using like a symbolic language that he with Bertrand Russell was able to attempt this massive project of translating all of mathematics into this symbolic language. And that failed with the Principia Mathematica, because eventually they found with Girdle and the Girdle Incompleteness is that any sort of formalized language is going to be one of two things, either consistent or complete, but not both. So you can't have a comprehensive model of all of reality with any sort of formalized system, because there's going to be things that are that are true that you can't explain within this constraints of the system that you're using. So language is a formalized system, and so Whitehead's able to kind of escape out of the limitations of language by having his math brain. And through that, he's coming through these, philosophical intuitions that are getting into the deeper metaphysical nature of reality that at the time he was really kind of ahead of the curve, both in terms of thinking about, the dimensions of space-time. Maybe there's different dimensions of the Riemannian space and other ways that, like that eventually Einstein used to be able to talk about the relativistic aspects of space and time. But Whitehead had a little bit different approach that was trying to abstract it even more into his like theory of extension and Meriology that I don't even fully comprehend. But he was kind of ahead of the curve and was understanding different aspects of general relativity, but also was ahead of the curve in terms of understanding this shift towards the quantum world, the quantum sort of description of reality, which, if you look at this tension between the general relativistic descriptions of reality versus the quantum reality, there are different math structures between those two realities that don't, they're not, you can't sort of have them talk to each other right now. And so there's a bit of, well, maybe the relativistic space-time emerges out of this infinite dimension Hilbert space or whatever, the quantum gravity or the quantum mechanics. And it's probably more likely that we're going to be able to have a fundamental basis of reality that is this quantum realm that then has the relativistic realm emerge out of that in some fashion. And I think, when I'm talking to Matt Siegel, he was talking about how this realm of potential is embedded within the sort of quantum wave function, but also within quantum mechanics itself, which is that there's an indeterminacy in terms of stuff that hasn't happened yet. And so it's sort of a probabilistic nature of the unfolding of reality. Whereas if you look at, the relativistic way, there's a way that you want to take space and spatialize it into this like a bread block of the universe where all of space and time has already happened. And we're just sort of deterministic beings that are kind of unfolding our fates in reality. But, all of time is just an illusion that's already happened. And it's just kind of like an illusion that time is unfolding. Whereas, the more way in which that, Whitehead is more about, there's this concrescence of this building up and that there's these emergence of all these energies that are kind of coming up together, and that there's, in some ways the metaphor of the quantum mechanics is like the collapsing of the wave function where all the different possibilities kind of collapse into what that concrete reality is. And then there's other people like Bohm who have a completely other different interpretation of that, but have also this dimension of like trying to, there's many different interpretations of quantum mechanics. There's the Everett many worlds interpretation, which tries to in some ways kind of spatialize every single different possible reality by kind of bifurcating and splitting the universe into all these different parallel worlds and parallel multiverses and parallel realities that are kind of orthogonal to reality that we can't observe directly, but mathematically the equations kind of say that's just as plausible as having the wave function collapse. And then it's sort of like you get to this metaphysical nature of reality where you can't have any test to know for sure, but this is where I get into like the philosophy of math, because when I talk to the mathematicians, the philosophy of math doesn't change most of how the math actually produces. Like there's no real, if you're just a pure mathematician who's just trying to use math as utility, your philosophy of math doesn't really matter. So like the foundations of math and the how it works and why it works, it's like that's not an essential question if you kind of think of math as a set of bricks and you just want to build a building. If you want to build a building with math, you don't need to know all these sort of metaphysical aspects of the nature of mathematics and what is the nature of a mathematical object? Is it real? Is it is it just a linguistic description of reality that has no ontological reality? If there's no platonic realm of ideal forms, as an example, like where there's like kind of like this formal causation that Aristotle talked about, where there's the blueprint of reality, and somehow there's the blueprint of reality that's interfacing with our reality. Whitehead gives the potential of these eternal objects, where there are the potential of these forms that are these mathematical constructs that are kind of in this Platonic realm, and somehow they are kind of interfacing with the nature of reality. This kind of like the formal causation would be that the mechanism from an Aristotelian perspective. But these questions of the philosophy of math, when I talk to these philosophers of math or mathematicians, I'll ask them, like, why, if it doesn't matter, then why what's the matter, and or like, why are you looking at it? And what they say is that in some ways, like, you're just curious about the nature of reality, and sometimes there may be insights about philosophy of math that apply to other aspects of your overall description of the nature of reality. But specifically, a good example is Girdle and the Incompleteness theorems. He was a strict Platonist. He really believed in this sort of Platonic realm of ideal forms, and he, in some ways, Whitehead also, when I talked to Matt Siegel, he was talking about, Bertrand Russell and Whitehead. They had this, in some sense, logical positivist desire to be able to prove that all of mathematics could be reduced to logic, right?
Yeah.
And that venture failed because of the Girdle incompleteness. And for Bertrand Russell, he kind of never really let go of that and kept on with that. And that really, in some sense, was part of the foundations of analytic philosophy. But yet, Whitehead was kind of liberated from that, as described by Matt Siegel in my interview with him. And he was like, well, actually, there's a dimension of intuition that is a part of the construction of math knowledge that can't be reduced down to a formula, that there's some sort of process by which humans are interfacing with maybe this Platonic realm of ideal forms, where we're trying to suss out these underlying patterns, and you need the human ability to make these inductive leaps of logic. And through that I think Girdle, with his ability to see this Platonistically driven motivation for him to look at some of these things, like this venture of the trying to reduce everything to logic. Well, for Girdle, there may have been things beyond logic that was still really valuable. And I don't know if he was trying to prove that there was a God through logic, but in some ways he kind of did that, because it was like he showed the limits of the logic. There's things outside of the formal system that are true, but you can't prove are true. And he did this with kind of like, translating all of the axioms and all the different things and statements that you can make in math into, using prime numbers into a set of equations, and then kind of logically proved through the liar paradox that there's going to be things that you can prove that that are outside of the system that are true that you can't prove are true, or that there's a sort of a mutually exclusive nature of completeness and consistency, that you couldn't have both of those entities at the same time. And so there's a mutually exclusive nature that you kind of have to use different branches of math to be able to, in some ways, reveal a different natures of reality, that you're able to understand natures of reality. But also it includes other things you can't see, which means that you have to use other math branches. And part of math as a process is trying to combine all these things to find out where you can combine them and sort of discover new mathematical knowledge through the combination of those things. And so, what the philosophers of math told me was that philosophy is like a spotlight, where you're saying, I think this might be true, and it shows you where to look. And someone who was a logical positivist maybe would have never looked to where Girdle was looking as a Platonist, who was trying to like understand, like, maybe there's stuff beyond this sort of systems of logic that we need this sort of human intuition aspect, or ways in which that there's limits to these logical systems, that they can't be complete. They can't sort of describe all of the nature of reality. And so I think that's where he kind of did this whole incompleteness there, was, for me, is probably one of the most radical innovations in the history of logic, but also like in philosophy. There's probably so many different philosophical applications that, for me, really point towards this pluralism. The pluralism means that, like, for every sort of ontological basis of reality, you're understanding different aspects of reality, but you're also missing different aspects. So it's really important to have this ontological pluralism. So to not be stuck into saying there's one way of seeing the world, but you actually have to sort of look at it through multiple lenses, whether it's through the lens of feminism, or the lens of through science, or through the lens of decolonialism, or through the lens of intersectionality and the ways in which that we have cultures that are really biased against marginalized communities, or Black, Indigenous, or people of color, the BIPOC perspectives. And so there's ways in which that you really have to have people from a diverse range of different perspectives at the table, because there's ways that your own worldview and your own experience is going to be extremely limited, and you need to have multiple perspectives and multiple views in order to really come up with systems that aren't biased against people and unduly, and that we already have a lot of these different ways in which that there's oppression, and certain populations have certain privilege or create systems that oppress others, and that there's a part of that mutual exclusive dialectics that are happening in that, in order to really come up with fair and just systems, that you really need to have different perspectives and different hold on different different people that different ways in which that you're able to integrate all these different ideas together. And I think ontologically, from a philosophical perspective, that's why you need to sort of look at like indigenous philosophy and Latin American philosophy, African philosophies, Buddhist philosophies. Each of these different philosophies are different lenses into the nature of reality. And the pluralism, I think, is in some ways kind of embedded into the process relational philosophies, because it is kind of embodying that. And that's why I think I'm really drawn to process philosophy, because you do see process philosophy being used in like theology to try to like bridge together different types of religions together. So there's a lot of interfaith, interdisciplinary collaborations that are happening with process philosophy. With Chinese philosophy, there's different aspects of Taoism where there's ways in which that the process philosophy has the Taoist perspectives that are embedded into it, but because the Confucianistic perspective is so dominant in China, that the process philosophy gives a cover to be able to kind of dig into the roots of a lot of the Taoist philosophies, that they're able to kind of integrate a lot of that back into their culture, but use the excuse of saying we're integrating the Western perspectives, but be able to kind of have a way to integrate all the different perspectives in a way that is able to kind of fuse all these different perspectives together. Or a phenomenological perspective that, from the perspective of VR, if you're only looking at the bias of Western science, then you may be missing different stuff.
Yeah.
So, that's a kind of a big overarching overview of why I'm so excited about the process philosophy, but also, how I see the philosophy is kind of, the pluralistic approach. But also, if I had a complaint about the virtual reality community, is that it is very biased towards this kind of analytic philosophy tradition, and trying to what I would say with the Whitehead's perspective of the misplaced concreteness. There's a lot of emphasis on knowledge is only produced through objective science that is turned into numbers. And there's a lot of ways in which the larger VR community is trying to create experiences that have a phenomenological basis and a market basis, where the experiences that are being able to be successful outside of being able to turn things into numbers, whereas in academia has a larger bias towards peer review and publication and the production of knowledge only coming through a certain fixed ontological process. And so there's, I think, a lack of deeper philosophical reflection when it comes to the production of knowledge within the VR industry. And I think that, in some ways that limits it. In some ways it gives the perspectives that the academics are able to provide, but at the same time it limits the academics, because they kind of get stuck into this echo chamber of the lack of deeper philosophical reflection upon some of these different aspects. So that's what I've noticed, and I wonder if we'll have this. There's always been a split between academia and industry across, pretty much everywhere, and I think it's partly because there's one that's being driven by what the market is saying, what the experiences are, versus what can be sort of proven through this understanding of epistemology and knowledge, and how knowledge is produced within a community. And for what I see in the future is that we're going to, have things like neurophenomenology, or ways in which that the phenomenology is going to be able to be blended in with some of the objective science. But that, there's people who have a lot of expertise within thousands of hours of VR. I would love to see different research that starts to tap into people who are able to talk about the subtle nuances of their direct phenomenological experiences, and be able to use that as something that's ontologically valid. People who are influencers, or people who are able to do a lot of ways in which they have an experience, are able to describe it in a way that when other people experience it, they're able to also have that same experience. So there's ways that knowledge can be produced within a community that doesn't have to be reduced down into sort of objectified, peer-reviewed or replicate. The thing about human experience is that you can't replicate it and you can't falsify it, right? So there's ways in which that the human experience has often been ignored from the scientific processes. But I feel like the phenomenological aspect is that whether that's through phenomenology directly or post-phenomenology, I feel like that there can be a lot more integration of the phenomenological perspectives philosophically into how knowledge is produced within the academic VR community.
Yeah, definitely. I share the frustration. There is a lot of things that are lost when you reduce an experience to a Likert scale. And I mean, it's an easy way to say that this was 20% better and so on, but does it give us the understanding of what experience this person actually had? That's questionable. And of course, we need both, right? It's interesting to be able to have this kind of knowledge that really can't predict in the same way. But I wish to relate this back to experiential design, which you mentioned, because when you were speaking about plurality and I mean, in terms of different designers and people who design VR systems, I mean, design is this: you have an idea, you have something in your mind, you would like to share a certain experience, but you're coming from a particular background and may have a certain relation to what you're seeing, which may not be what the other person is experiencing, right? You can't sort of design an experience. So do you have any reflection based on that? What do you put in this term, experiential design?
Yeah, well, I talked about, just wanted to reflect back on the Likert scale.
Yeah.
And what we were talking about with the Girdle incompleteness. So with the whole idea of Girdle incompleteness is that any way you try to describe something is going to be either consistent or complete. So to take an experience and turn it into a number scale, the Likert scale, that is in some ways giving you some insight of the experience, but also occluding other aspects, right? So it's important to have multiple lenses that you're looking at it, like a phenomenological lens, a direct oral history of the lens, looking at the lens of how did it make you feel, or what was the quality experience, the context of experience. So for me, with my experiential design, I was talking to Mel Sater, and he said that Stephen Ellis said that any sufficiently good theory of presence is going to have different equivalence classes within them. And so I think what that means is that within my experiential design, let's take an example of the qualities of presence. You have mental and social presence, you have active presence, you have embodied presence, you have emotional presence. So I'd say those are equivalence classes where there's all of those different qualities of presence are happening all at the same time. But as an experiential designer, you have a center of gravity of what you really want to focus on. So within VRChat, it's really focusing on the embodied presence of your avatar representation, and you're in this worlds that you're able to really customize. Whereas relative to say Rec Room, you don't have as much avatar options within Rec Room. You only have a certain limits for what you give, but yet within VRChat, you have millions and millions of different VR representations, and you can upload your own avatar to be pretty much whatever you want. There's limits in terms of their terms of service and their code of conduct in terms of what kind of public avatars you have. But private avatars, you can really do whatever you want within the context of private worlds and in private contexts. So that's one example of how the architecture of VRChat is really optimizing for this sense of embodied presence to really give you your sense of your expression of your identity that is a trade-off versus, say alt space. You want to have more of a meritocracy in terms of you just want people to have professional gathering. You don't want them to stress out about having an avatar that is not as cool as other people. So there's like a tiered level of, the different time and energy that you have to really invest in creating a customized avatar that's really expressing your identity. Well, in alt space, you don't have to worry about that because everybody has kind of the same stock different avatars that you have. And so maybe there's an amplification of the types of mental and social presence you have that is less about your own individual identity expression and more about creating a group cohesion that is a shared identity that people are able to connect with. And so that's one example of how there are kind of like equivalence classes of trade-offs. A big trade-off within interactive media is the degree to which that you have agency that you're able to express versus the degree that you're telling a story, which is storytelling is all about having control over authorship, of building and releasing tension over time as it unfolds. Well, once you introduce agency into that equation, that disrupts the ability of which you're allowing that building and releasing of that tension unfolding, because it's more about people expressing their agency and, about them having traces of their agency, having these gameplay loops, which is different than, say, building and releasing intention in an authored way. So there's this sort of dialectic between authored narrative and generative narrative that at the heart of it has differences in, say, emotional presence that you get from being able to watch a movie versus the sense of active presence that you get from, say, watching and playing a video game and having an open world exploration. Excuse me. So you have these different qualities of presence, active presence and mental and social presence and embodied presence and emotional presence. But yet at the same time, again, like I talked about Girdle and Incompleteness, that has nothing to say about the context of the experience and how that context is related to, education or entertainment. It's sort of independent of that. So it's yet, kind of taking that pluralistic approach of saying there's one axis with a set of equivalence classes that are in dialectic with each other that you have to make decisions. Well, here's another set of equivalence classes of the context. Right now we're in this world that's like got this amazing sort of background, but we're talking about deep philosophical ideas. And so in some ways, this sort of abstract nature of this world is kind of reflecting the high-end realm of Platonic forms, of idea forms, as these objects kind of floating through here. So we're having this resonance between the context of this philosophical discussion and the world that we're in, right? So there's ways in which that the context of a world can serve certain needs. And so if you have an educational context, maybe you have the world where you really want to immerse people into history, or a medical context where maybe eventually doctors are going to be able to take all this biometric data and put it into a spatialized experience that they're able to understand different dimensions of the relational dynamics of what's happening in your body, that they're going to be able to turn that into medical advice, or avatar representation of your identity is another context, or the context of selling and buying different objects and what the future of like eBay or Amazon or virtual goods like a virtual market is probably doing a lot of innovations in terms of selling virtual goods, and education or remote work, or death and grieving, or connecting to home and family, connecting to romantic partners and going on dates. So, going on a date with a partner versus you being at work, well, those are two completely different contexts that have inherent tensions and trade-offs between your public and private life that have certain equivalence classes within that context that are different than the types of equivalence classes from the qualities of presence, which are different than the types of equivalence classes that are coming in when you have your expression of your character, which are different than the different types of equivalence classes when it comes to telling a story. So, those are the four major different types of equivalence classes, but really what I would argue is that each philosophical orientation is going to have its own way of understanding what those trade-offs are. So like, say, feminist philosophy is going to be looking at whole other different relational dynamics of gender, and Marxist philosophy is going to be looking at the power dynamics of like economies and capital, and power dynamics of different decolonized philosophies are going to be looking at the ways in which that the power dynamics of colonial powers, and how is the colonialism being spread out through all of VR. And it's hard to say, just look at through quality context and, the equivalence classes that I have. They don't always necessarily incorporate a feminist perspective or a decolonized perspective or perspective of an indigenous perspective of how the indigenous people have been treated. So again, this gets back to Girdle, where, there's a certain ways in which that each of these lenses are revealing stuff, but they're also including stuff that you can't see, which is why it's important to have kind of a pluralistic way of having many different design strategies and design entities that are having a look at, how to design different things. So that's at least how I kind of connect the kind of pluralism with at least my experiential design. My experiential design is coming out of my own direct experience, and it's when I have an experience, this is the language that I use. But like I said, I have different feminist inclinations, but I'm a cisgendered male, and so there's certain things that when I go through certain experiences that are just occluded to me. There's an experience that which was the gnomes and goblins that I went through and my wife went through, and we were going on a walk and we were sharing our experiences, and her experience of that was way different than my experiences because there's no female representative avatars within this experience. It's all sort of quote unquote gender neutral avatars, but the gender neutral avatars are actually all male. Essentially, they're male presenting. There's no female presenting avatars. And so what's it feel like to be in a VR experience where an entire world has no females? It's all completely male. Even though they're theoretically gender neutral, they're still male presenting.
Yeah.
So, what's that mean for diversity and inclusion when you've essentially not given a way for maybe women who are female presenting and want to see how the male and females dynamics of this gnomes and goblins world play out, but when you've completely eradicated it by pretending it doesn't exist, then that can be a problem where you've just tried to sort of eradicate it. By that eradication, you've actually sort of emphasized the negative aspects of some of the patriarchal biases by not having maybe good representation and diverse representation. Maybe something like that would have come up way earlier in the design process so that they wouldn't be delivering something that is completely blind to sort of a feminist perspective. So that's why you need to have, in some ways, as many diverse perspectives at the table in the creation of these processes as you can, but also to have many different diverse voices beyond just my own voice, but other voices that are critiquing different things from their own perspective, because there's often value in terms of things that people are coming from their own experiences that they're able to share. And there's ways in which that my wife was able to articulate her own direct experience that was a part of her visceral embodied experience and what it felt like for her. And it was way more powerful for me to just do an interview with her from the perspective of oral history, which is why I personally love the format of oral history, because it allows me to really listen to other people's experiences without having to try to speak on other people's behalf on what their experiences are, when they can really speak on it better for themselves and then really capture that and put it into this larger context for people to listen to. Because the way that my wife talked about this gnomes and goblins experience went way beyond what I would ever be able to articulate, because it just wasn't part of my own experience as a male. And there were things that she experienced that she has lifetimes of her experience that are replicated in this virtual experience that she was able to articulate. And so she was able to communicate that in a way that I would have never been able to. And so I recognize my own limits of what I can speak on behalf of, like, these intersectional perspectives. If I'm not a part of that intersectional identity, then I have no right to be able to try to articulate what that experience is like. What I really need to do is really listen to those intersectional perspectives, and to the best that I can, seek out those perspectives and listen to them and incorporate them into the larger corpus of the body of work that I'm doing.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I think this, from the post-phenomenological perspective, and you asked briefly earlier where the sort of post comes from, and that would actually be in regards to exactly that, because normal or traditional classical phenomenology often sort of presumes this this given standpoint that the phenomenology sort of will be the same, that we have these things in common to that extent, whereas post-phenomenology stresses the multi-stability of experiences, so that the same thing can be experienced in different ways depending on your own situated perspective, who you are, stuff like gender, culture, and so on, and that these multi-stabilities must be explored in order to that there is no essence to a certain object or technology in any way, but that it has several ways of being interpreted or experienced. And I think that's really important. We take into consideration that when you have a VR application or something that is being designed, it's not really finished because it doesn't include the user. It's sort of being instantiated at every given moment through, we could call it a process. That's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, there's a map of intersectional identities that I came across that really sort of maps it on the axes of privilege and those who are from these marginalized or oppressed communities, that kind of identify all these different axes with some indigenous, sort of patriarchy or feminist perspectives and women, and whether or not you have children or not have children, ability, sort of the axes that happen. So for me, I mean, I appreciate the post-phenomenology has been able to incorporate all that, but for me, I already get a lot of that from sort of the process relational ontologies that are, in some ways trying to look at these Meriological structures that are have these whole part relationships of these different scales of culture. And there's a theory that I was referencing a lot, Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory, where he was trying to look at these. He was looking at through the lens of how the future of kind of technology and cyber realities, and how, as a lawyer, he was seeing how there's kind of like these dials to kind of shift collective culture, and he identified these four axes, basically, of there's the culture, where there's cultural dimensions of education and ways that people are communicating with each other. There's the law and way that the law shapes the larger culture of what is and is not possible, but also within the context of virtual environments. There's the code in which the code of conduct, or the terms of service, or the privacy policy, or ways in which that the code becomes the law of what is and is not possible within the context of these virtual worlds. But also, the third is like the market dynamics of ways in which that economies are made, whether it's open economies or closed wall garden economies, or you can shift the behavior of Facebook by having a competitor that is creating alternative technologies that are also shaping this. And the last one is the technological architecture and the code. Where it's at the heart of it, the ways in which that the actual hardware and the technology are kind of shaping collective behaviors. And so these are four different areas in which that, if you wanted to shift collective behavior, so if you want to look at any sufficiently complicated ethical dimension within technology, you have to look at it through the lens of, okay, what is the culture doing already? What is happening, say like with harassment and trolling in VR? People are going to be bad people already. And if they're already bad people within the world, then they're going to bring that cultural biases within the technology. And there's only so much limited stuff you could do with trying to, control people. You could record everything that they're doing within VR, but then there's trade-offs between the safety that you have versus the privacy that you have. And so to what degree that you want to have safe spaces, to what degree of privacy that you want to have. And so there's trade-offs there, but there's also looking at it like, okay, there are things you can do from a technological architecture where you have personal space bubbles, you have the ability to block people, you have, private instances. There's ways that you can kind of create architecture within the virtual spaces that help prevent some of these harassment and trolling. But there's also ways in which that, maybe there's economic dynamics where you have competitors that have different philosophies for how you deal with that type of, like VRChat versus Facebook Horizon is going to have vastly different ways in which they're approaching this issue of harassment and trolling. And then the aspect of the law is the degree to which that the governments have to pass either, the international groups come up with human rights law, that human rights law feeds into it, or there's, GDPR, which is a way that, local laws that feed into privacy architectures, or federal privacy laws or other laws that are happening within the United States context, which would shape these things. And so as I was looking at Lawrence Lessig's, his pathetic dot theory, which has, those four aspects of the culture, the market dynamics and the law, as well as the architecture, the technological architecture and the code, and I realized that there's kind of like a Meriological nested whole part structure to being able to talk about this, because at the largest context, you have the culture, because the culture is able to shape the laws, it shapes the economy, and it shapes the technological architecture and code. And so you have highest context, you have the culture, and then the next context, you have different aspects of the laws that are passed. So those laws are shaping all of, the culture shapes the laws, but then the laws shape everything that's below that. In terms of then within the context of the laws are the economics that happen. So like right now, there's a lawsuit between Epic versus Apple, where they're trying to change what the laws are to be able to have new market dynamics, because everything that Apple's doing is legal right now, according to what the laws are. But there may be ways in which that the spirit of this antitrust and creating these monopolies, that they're able to create these platforms and, is essentially equivalent to imagine if the creators of the PC took a proprietary approach and said, every transaction that you ever did on any computing device that, the inventor of either the internet or the computer would be able to take a 30% cut.
Yeah.
That's what we're facing with the future of XR, is that like Apple or Facebook want to, in perpetuity, to ever always take a certain cut of all interaction and transaction. Well, that's sort of against the antitrust, a spirit of antitrust that was created. And so does there need to be a dialogue between that economic behavior and the laws that are in the context to change the laws to change the economic behavior? And the last, sort of the heart, you have the human experience, but you have the human experience that's mediated by the technological architecture and the code. And so as I look at the post-phenomenological approaches, and I see your approach of trying to map out some of these different relational dynamics, I see that the Meriological approach of the nested contexts of something like a process relational philosophy like Whitehead and process philosophy already has that embedded into it. And it's more of a matter of trying to identify what that hierarchy of nested contexts are. I'm saying that it's the that it's the culture and the cultural context, and then the laws, and then the economy, and then the technological architecture and the code, with the human beings kind of being embedded into that relationship. But you could, argue that the culture is a subset of the laws, or you could take the Lawrence Lessig approach, which is basically that there is no nested hierarchy, that they're all individual entities, and that there is certainly feedback loops amongst all those. And so whether or not it's a nested hierarchy or whether or not it's sort of a flat, either way, there's relationships. And the important aspect, I think, that is similar between the post-phenomenological approach, at least from what I've seen so far, as well as the process relational approach, is that it's all about trying to identify what those stakeholders are and map out those relational dynamics, and to have a deeper understanding of how those relational dynamics kind of feed down into something like you said, the difference between phenomenology and post-phenomenology, of trying to create this, all human experiences equivalent versus, well, no, actually there are some variances and mutually exclusive dialectics between intersectional experiences that we need to account for by looking at it through these other lenses that are important to identify there.
Yeah, I think process philosophy sounds really promising to get that sort of full view of all the actors and how they play together in the space. That's and I really enjoy that Meriological, or what you would call it. You sent me also some slides that showed these different sort of ways that these are structured and play into each other, and it looks really interesting. I think that, and I want to ask you also, to what extent process philosophy has been concerned with technologies explicitly, or is it more this general overview of all the processes? Because the specificity can also have value in that sense, that you can actually provide a description of something rather concrete as it is in experience. So, I mean, in describing the experience of, say, a certain VR application using process phenomenology, or process philosophy in this way, I mean, would you then have to sort of draw a map over the whole world, or every contributing agent, and how this is manifesting in experience? Or is it more to sort of map and see the space of the different actors that are affecting the technology? Or what do you look for in a philosophy that can inform VR?
Yeah, well, so I'd say generally process philosophy is, because it's, process relational metaphysics, and as distinct from, say, substance metaphysics, it's still an emerging field that is taking root in, say, other areas first, I think ahead of technology. There probably are some process relational, philosophers of technology. But I haven't found them yet, or maybe they're certainly out there. And I'd love to talk to them more. But where I see it mostly is, say, in ecological circles, a lot of process philosophy, and the philosophy of biology is really quite huge. There's ways that the religion and process theology is taking root by like John Cobb, and a lot of ways of open relational theology is a huge movement. Chinese philosophy and integrating process philosophy. There's been some movements of, say, looking at the lower levels of quantum mechanics and taking a process relational approach of new kind of neurological extensions at the quantum realm, and looking at some of those different metaphors to kind of like say, maybe process philosophy is actually giving us new insights into some of these open problems of like quantum mechanics. And I know that Matthew Siegel has argued that Whitehead's approach does actually create this way to kind of resolve some of these tensions between the general relativistic approach and the quantum realities, where there's been these gaps. But most of our existing science kind of puts physics as the base of all of the other kind of, you have the physics, and then from there you have like chemistry and biology, and it kind of builds up with the core is physics. And part of what Whitehead is doing a little bit of the shift from physics into biology. And so looking at the basis of reality as these organisms, and once you do that, then you start to have this whole other shift. Within the realm of mathematics, I think you could argue that category theory and set theory are also very process relational. Set theory is the basis of kind of the foundations, takes a process relational approach, but also I think category theory takes it even a step further. And so there's been a lot of work in terms of using category theory as the foundations of mathematics, which I think is very exciting. And there's lots of different epistemological and ontological interesting aspects of, say, being able to take, category theory is a way to category theoretically describe all of the mathematics, so that you could take mathematics and then do sort of an algebraic geometry translation of a problem, use the tools of algebraic geometry to kind of solve something and do this translation back, and then you'd be able to have this proof. And so there's a ways in which that you do this translation between different branches of mathematics, which is really philosophically quite interesting from an epistemological perspective of like, what is knowledge? Can you just use the category theoretical descriptions of things to be able to kind of prove things, rather than using proof, but using the descriptions, just because you're able to prove things just by describing it in this way. So that's an area that has a lot of interest. And generally I see that there's a lot of applications of category theory, and both computer science is a hot topic, but also artificial intelligence in ways in which that I suspect that a lot of the underlying ways in which the different basically machine learning is all about creating thousands of different feature sets and trying to map out the different relational dynamics. And so in some ways artificial intelligence is the shift to a process relational ontology. Whether or not there's AI people that are explicitly describing it that, a lot of the mathematical basis and how AI is working is moving into a more process relational reality that I see is happening. And I think over time, you'll see more process relational ideas being embedded into the core philosophy of artificial intelligence, and what intelligence actually is when you describe intelligence as a mapping of the relational dynamics, and how to, say, incorporate existing knowledge domains and then do these translations of being able to look at Wikipedia and then do zero-shot learning and be able to do here's a problem that's difficult. I could tell you the identification of a bird based upon what it looks like, right? And you see those identifications, and immediately you're able to identify, oh, that's that bird that you told me what these things I should look for. Well, that's very difficult to do within the context of AI, which usually requires showing like thousands and thousands and thousands different types of examples, and then it's able to kind of detect what those features are. But to be able to give a verbal description of what something is and have those conceptual ideas and be able to translate that into into knowledge, I think that some of the stuff that Google just showed at Google I/O is starting to lean towards that, having different ways of doing concepts and doing more, eventually we'll get to artificial general intelligence, which is that entities will be able to go through across all different contexts. And from that, they'll be able to be intelligently able to kind of make these different relationships. But one of the big gaps of artificial intelligence has been common sense.
Yes.
So common sense is ways in which that we are invisibly mapping relational dynamics that are so intuitively obvious to us that we don't even need to describe them just because they're a part of our embodied experiences, right? So part of something even like common sense reasoning requires making something that's implicit to us explicit within artificial intelligence, which in essence is a process of mapping out all those relational dynamics. So I see that, process relational ontologies are going to be embedded into all these emerging technologies, especially into virtual reality. But, in terms of philosophy of technology, I haven't seen it as much. The way that I do see it is in ethics and tech ethics, because part of what's happening right now is that you have all these new paradigms of technology, whether that's artificial intelligence or virtual reality, cryptocurrencies. You have the ways in which that the technology is kind of pushing in new capabilities and new affordances, and it's taking all the existing human context and it's kind of blurring context together. So just as an example of that, these immersive technologies have an incredible amount of my body, what I'm looking at, how I'm moving. Well, you could take that data and be able to extrapolate and be able to determine certain medical conditions in people, right? So consumer technology is now able to gather data that has a medical context, but it's using it within a surveillance capitalism context. And so how do you deal with the blurring of a context of the ethical implications of that? Should Facebook be detecting whether or not you have a neurodegenerative disease based upon how your hand movements are moving? Do they have an ethical obligation to tell you that? Or do they have an ethical obligation to not even measure that and to just ignore that? Where's the line between how much medical information are you willing to disclose to this this company that's going to be collecting all sorts of information that has a very unclear fiduciary relationship between you in terms of they have a power asymmetry in terms of how much power they have versus all this information and data they have. And so what the future of privacy is, and by the way, both privacy and identity are very contextual, and I would argue, relational in terms of how we're in relationship to different contexts. Our identity for who we are around our parents, around our friends and family, around at work, around at school, around our romantic partners. Each of these different contexts, we have different relational parts that are a part of our identity that can be described in both a contextual and relational dynamic. So part of identity has a contextual and relational dynamic, as well as privacy in terms of what is the information that is exchanging across different contexts and whether or not that should be public or private. So all of where I see the intersection here is that we have a failure of our existing paradigms of how we understand and model technology.
Yeah.
And that we need more robust relational models in order to have the type of tech ethics that we need to be able to say where these boundaries are. We're blurring all these boundaries and we don't know how we're blending all these things together. We need a better mapping of those stakeholders, those relational dynamics, those contexts, and to know what the boundaries are and what the limits are, what's okay and what's not okay, given the certain context and given what you're willing to disclose based upon what stakeholders are present. So I'm willing to give information to a doctor who's giving the medical advice in the context of medical doctor's appointment, but I don't want that same information into, say, strangers on the internet that may be tracking my eye tracking, that is trying to sort of exploit or profit off of me in ways that I'm not fully aware of or consenting to with my informed consent. So where I see the relational philosophies is in this realm of ethics right now, but also eventually in experiential design, because I feel like experiential design by its nature is also very relational in phenomenological, but trying to kind of change and decide, if I tweak this aspect of the experience, how does this modulate someone's consciousness and change their own direct experience? But right now, I don't, a lot of, I'd say 95% of all of reality, probably even 99%, people are still stuck in substance metaphysics, concrete reality, physicalism, materialism, sort of the scientific paradigm is very much based on that. And so we have to find new models of epistemology, how to integrate phenomenology, but also I think in some ways virtual reality is going to be on the bleeding edge of that, because you have the capability to maybe challenge, to solve some of the hardest problems of phenomenology in terms of the unique contextual dimensions of that. But trying to see people as these unique individual entities rather than what most of the objectified ways of turning things into numbers is aggregate ways of describing people. So eventually we're going to be able to get to the point where we have personalized medicine and be able to identify different aspects of your personality and your temperament and be able to give you just the right experience of what you need right now, or the right medicine, or that's the goal, I think, of where it's sort of get away from the aggregate for what is going to work for the most people, and get into this, which is one dialectic, and the other dialectic is what's going to be perfect for me right now at this moment, which is, like I said, when we talked about the incompleteness aspects, if you only use one methodology, you're going to only be looking at the aggregate experiences while missing this other sort of thing that you can really personalize for this individual.
Yeah, and there's, like you said, we're stuck in this substance metaphysics, and you mentioned AI, and I mean, that was kind of the reason why AI didn't live up to the hype when it was first introduced, and all the sort of the errors that it faced was because when we were trying to model the way our minds work, and we were basically just trying to involve the sentences and the logic that we make up inside the computers, but we forgot that there's so much more to this, because we already have this intentional relation where things are inherently meaningful for us. We have concerns and so on in relation to a world that's precognitive, and the failure to realize that in the models that sort of gave first generation of AI systems then completely failed. And it's still a big issue, because computers don't have, they're created in a way that we are not, and they don't have this involvement with reality sort of de facto. So that's, but by the way, when you're mentioning ethics, I think it's worth to mention that, I mean, you're leading this IEEE Global Ethics XR initiative, or what it's called. Would you like to tell something about that? Because it's, I think it's a really important project.
Yeah, I mean, I had been, so back in 2016 or so is when I first started hearing about privacy within covering virtual reality. It's a discussion that I was a part of, hearing, like there was a report from Upload VR where they had reported that there was information that Facebook was reporting back and sort of phoning home information, but not disclosing it. And they did a report on it. I don't know what that actually, I don't actually remember or recall what they were actually doing, but they did a report, and then it got the attention of Al Franken in Congress, and he wrote a letter to Facebook saying, hey, what are you doing on this, this, and this? But at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference on that 2016, after that story had broken, and that, there's a discussion within the broader immersive community about privacy. And I think that's what sort of started me. And as I started to talk about it, there was more people that were starting to say, hey, but what about this? What about this? And it ends up being probably one of the biggest open questions in terms of the threats to our mental privacy. And there's a lot of different efforts that are happening. Just this week, actually, there's going to be a symposium on the neuroethics of that's sponsored by Facebook Reality Labs and Columbia Neuroethics Initiative. And so well, to take a step back, I helped to help organize the VR Privacy Summit at Stanford University in like November of 2018 with Jessica Outlaw and Jeremy Bailenson and Philip Rosedale. And in that, we were bringing together 50 people under Chatham House rules from across the industry. And I think we had broad ambitions that we'd be able to, in the course of one day, come out and come up with a manifesto or a sort of a direction for how everybody should approach this and sort of live into the most ethical future. But I think what I realized was that this is such a complicated, vast issue of trying to define it, and it's really difficult to try to come up with some declarative boundaries in terms of what is okay and what is not okay, but also, looking at the relational dynamics of the broader culture and how the culture feeds into the laws and what laws need to change, if they need to change, versus the economy, versus what we're doing from the technological architecture and the code. And so in some ways, there's a challenge of move fast and break things within technology, but yet technology moves so quickly, but that, you know, the conceptual frameworks that you have in terms of all of the different policy levels that lags behind anywhere from 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, the problems that we're facing with social media and the degree to which that you could do filter bubbles of reality or fake news or you know, information warfare from state actors that are using these social networking platforms in ways that we never imagined. But because they're at the scale of reaching billions of people, there's behaviors in which these state governments are using these network technologies to bring about drastic shifts in culture. And so what are the tech ethics? Like, where do you, you know, from the less sympathetic dot theory, at what point do you have some sort of intervention, from a legal intervention, from a cultural intervention, to an economic intervention, to the underlying technological architecture and code intervention, to be able to handle these different issues? And I think the ethical issues are all around, okay, you have agency, limited agency in each of these different collective scopes. How do we make sure that we don't create what's equivalently like a dystopic future of where all this can go, where you have big brother of these governments who have access to everything that we're thinking, everything we're doing, the full context that we're doing in these immersive realities, and for them to be able to basically just pipe that into a big database and to be able to put social scores on people and dictate what kind of benefits they can and cannot do based upon their behaviors in these virtual worlds. I mean, it's already happening to some extent in China, but here we're talking about like the degree to which that, you know, the neuroethics, they have like these human rights principles of these 5 different neuroethics principles that these 3 authors put forth in this paper. Trying to say it's now is the time to be able to talk about neuroethics, and we're going to be talking about that at this sort of neuroethics conference that's happening on the 26th of May at Columbia University. But the 5 principles are the right to agency, the right to mental privacy, the right to identity, the right to be free from algorithmic bias, and the right to have fair access to technologies. So for each of these different rights, you know, how do you ensure that we maintain our right to mental privacy? The right to mental privacy means that you have ideas that you want to express and you want to say something. Well, if you have, you know, Facebook reading your mind and all this stuff, and basically coming inferences about stuff, and maybe they start speaking on your behalf about what you like and who you are, you know, there's a part of your own freedom of expression that gets that's tied into this right to mental privacy and your right to identity. When, you know, you have a machine that could potentially be learning more about yourself than you know about yourself. And if somebody has control over that, to what degree are they able to undermine your own sense of your agency? So agency, identity, right to mental privacy, the right to be free from algorithmic bias, of, you know, algorithms that are sort of preferencing one group over another, or even, you know, the tension that I'd say Facebook is the most concerned around is the right to fair access, where Facebook is willing to sort of make compromises on your privacy in order to give fair access to technology. So they will be arbitrarily lowering the cost of the technology to get it into the hands of more people, but yet they may be undermining our right to mental privacy or our right to agency or the right to identity by doing that. And so this is, again, like equivalence classes between these different contexts, and how do you weigh the trade-offs between those? And I think that's the heart of these ethical questions. And so, yeah, we've been meeting, and we've got a group of different academics that have come together to be able to discuss this. And, you know, my observation so far is that in some ways it is easier to be very narrowly focused on one topic, and to have 1 or 2 authors be very polemic and to say something, and then to have another couple authors respond to it, to try to like solve this comprehensive challenge with hundreds of people and across this big, wide, vast of these different contexts. While it's still emerging and iterating, there's a technology pacing gap for a reason, which is what Thomas Metzinger says, which is that, you know, the pace of technology moves at such a faster pace because all the things that they're looking at, they're just looking at making technology that responds to the market, right? The unintended consequences of how that ripples out and changes society is something that the tech policymakers have to not only understand the nature of the technology, but have a very sophisticated model to understand the ways in which the technology is actively shifting these collective dynamics of culture, which, by the way, is not an easy thing to do. Yeah, and to know how to change the laws, then to sort of bring things back into balance. The technology is moving at such a accelerated rate that is, arguably at least 5, 10, or multiple decades ahead of where the tech policy is of being able to respond to that. So whether that's, we need to have more of a tighter feedback loop between this and to understand how the tech policy could be rapidly iterated and more of a way that technology is being iterated in an iterative, by the way, process relational, iterative is agile development process, which is distinctly different than, say, architecture, the development of a linear film or a building, or laws, which once the laws are set become this static concrete object that needs to maybe implement more process relational ideas, like having sunsets to these laws because maybe the laws serve their purpose and they need to go away, or how do you iterate between seeing that there's harms that are being done, and how do you come up with policy that is able to kind of shift this larger dynamic between all these four aspects that we're talking about, with the market dynamics and the laws and the culture at large, but also how the technological architecture is kind of like there's feedback loops amongst all these different entities. It's a complex nonlinear system. So to even understand it and to know sort of from a causal perspective, like what is causing what in this equation, of this nonlinear dynamics. And so I think that's why if you start to break it down into sort of a process relational, maybe looking at it from the ecological perspective, we may have better ways of not only modeling the technology, but knowing how, given this input vector into this complex nonlinear system, that's going to maybe change that. I'm not presuming that whatever we end up doing with the IEEE is going to be able to, the goal is to be able to produce like a white paper or a research paper or some policy recommendations. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to these technology players that are, moving forward. They need to have some sort of ethical design, ethically aligned design principles of what those boundaries are. But we also need the experiential designers to have that, but also the policymakers.
Yeah.
But also, do we need new laws that sort of shift other dynamics to make sure that we have, just like what is happening with Tim Sweeney and Epic? I think that lawsuit is so critical in terms of the future of where this all goes. If Epic loses, this is creating a future where we're going to have these closed walled garden platforms where we're not going to have an open metaverse. We're going to have the Apple metaverse. We're going to have the Facebook metaverse. And we're not going to have the sort of vision of what the science fiction dreamers have dreamed of having this interchange of being able to have, less having control over one entity, but have it more of a decentralized and open entity. Because if the hardware technology isn't there, then we're going to need to have open hardware, which, if they lose, and we may have a short period where we have a closed walled garden metaverse for 5 to 10 years, up to the point where we have more penetration in terms of these technologies out into the culture, and to the point where there's something that's real different that sort of an open hardware initiative would be able to provide, that nothing that the big major tech companies could provide. So there's a couple of ways where that can continue to go out. But, like I said, this IEEE global initiative on the ethics of extended reality that I've been involved with, we're trying to sort of, look at some of these issues and try to put together some ideas. And hopefully have those ideas be translated into the wider community. But like I said, it's a really difficult thing. And
I can imagine.
The initial idea of it's such a complicated issue and it's a volunteer effort, and so it really needs to be funded and people working full time, and having maybe more tightly focused subject matter experts on these different areas. So yeah, I think as it unfolds, we'll see how it continues and where it ends up.
Yeah, that is absolutely an immense task to even just begin the conversation, and you get all these people who have their own perspective, which is of course extremely valuable. But in terms of Facebook, and I like the way you're connecting this to the Epic and Apple lawsuits, because I mean, right now you could argue in the same way that the App Store is sort of becoming, the way that applications are present in everyday people's lives, right? You have the same thing with Google, which is basically the internet because it's sort of where you're finding everything and where the web pages come through. And you have Facebook, which is really dominating the way people have social relations online. And when this gets into the VR space, and Facebook has already been very gardeny. I mean, when you really had to have Facebook with a verified ID, etc. And if you decide that you want to, I mean, for instance, I linked up to Facebook voluntarily because I wanted to check it out. I wanted to know where this was going, and then I found out I can't unlink it without losing all my games. That was kind of a dick move. So they are definitely exercising power to have this platform that is becoming. I mean, if you imagine like the Facebook of the future, which is in VR, and you have this metaverse thing, which basically everyone is using Facebook and Oculus because it's cheaper, it's the best, there's no real competitor as of yet, at least. Then if we could have that same conversation, like when does the metaverse, which is originally just a private platform, when does it sort of belong to the public? And I'm definitely hoping that. I mean, it doesn't look like Facebook is going to change their mind anytime soon about the Facebook requirement, because that is a long-term strategy. They do it in terms of business. They're funding the headsets. They're really thinking many years into the future. So what are you thinking about, about Facebook, about this walled garden tendency, everyone trying to lurk you into their stores and stay there, and you can't leave, and
Yeah, well, I think it's worth going back to what I was talking earlier, which is the Simon Wardley model of these different phases. Which, by the way, now that we've talked a little bit more about process philosophy, Simon Wardley's model is a process relational approach because he's looking at how technology evolves through different phases of like a process where all of the technologies go through like an initial idea. It's an academic idea that you may see at IEEE or SIGGRAPH, or the military's funding an idea just to make sure it's possible. It's like a duct tape prototype, or it costs millions of dollars to produce the first, the Sword of Damocles, or whatever Tom Furness was doing in the 60s with the Air Force and augmented reality. But you take that idea, it moves to the next phase, to the custom bespoke enterprise, and from the enterprise, the VR was incubated with cave systems and NASA and millions of dollars of Silicon Valley or Silicon Graphics machines. And so once consumer VR came up with Oculus, and you have these big major companies and the other competitors of Vive and Sony and Google for a little bit, and Apple is getting into the game, and so and Microsoft, you have each of these different entities that are creating their own hardware that is the consumer space, right? And in that consumer space, they're developing their own distribution platforms. And then eventually the technology is going to get to the point where it's a mass commodity. Maybe. Like I said, computers got there, but the cell phones are kind of like, there's a duopoly in cell phones where it's basically the operating system is either going to be like iOS and Android, and there's some like alternative Linux based, but like in terms of like the majority of most of what people use, more often than not, it's going to be either iOS or Android, right? So I'd say arguably even cell phones kind of have been stuck in the consumer space, where even though there's plurality when it comes to tech hardware, the fact that they could use Android as an operating system is still kind of like creating this duopoly between Google and Apple in that sense. So with the XR technologies, because Microsoft and Facebook missed out on that missed out on that cell phone duopoly, they've invested billions of dollars into be able to try to create their own ecosystem, be a big player. That's why I think you see Facebook so willing to invest so much money, because they know that this is the next computing platform of both augmented and virtual reality. It's going to be the next cell phone. It's not going to replace cell phones. It's going to be a new platform that people, just like people use their cell phones of them be above and beyond what they use their computer for, but they still use a computer for some stuff that's way better. Just the same, there's going to be some stuff that is going to be way better to do on your virtual or augmented reality device than even a cell phone or 2D device, but there's still going to be stuff that you may want to still do on your cell phone and still want to do on your computer. I think we're moving into the future. We're going to have all of these different technologies that don't completely supplant each other. So given all of that, will we get into this mass ubiquity phase? And I think that's where the Epic versus Apple lawsuit gets into, because until there's a change in the law, we're going to be in this duopoly. We're going to be stuck in this sort of consumer walled garden phase. But what Simon Wardley talks about in terms of this phase between these four phases of the genesis of an idea, the custom bespoke application, the consumer application, and the mass commodity where it reaches the ubiquity, the open standards and the kind of commodification of the technology is there's different levels of a tech stack. And so there's certain aspects of, say, like cloud rendering or, the 5G. There's ways in which that there's still commercial aspects, but it's a commodification of things that sort of it adds to the platform, right? So whether that's identity and your avatar representation, and so open standards like VRM, you might be able to be in VRChat here, but if you wanted to export this as an identity, we could have all this experience right now. Aside from maybe the camera and the user interface, we could be in a WebXR experience. We'd be having the same experience right now, where we're in a virtual space, we're in our virtual headsets, but you're also recording it for a 2D. So there could be feature parity for the open version. But I had this discussion with Neil Trevitt back, I think it was like 2015 at the GDC, and Neil is a part of the Kronos Group, and Kronos Group is a part of creating the open standards. At that point, that was before OpenXR had even been specified, right? And WebXR was still like WebVR, and we had some ideas of open standards, but like in terms of like ways in which to make these immersive technologies more like a PC that you could sort of plug in a USB peripheral and it would be able to work, right? In order to have that, you need to have a certain amount of standardization across all the different, aspects of the technology. And so OpenXR, the fact that exists was great because it allowed each of these different platforms to start to relook at their initial APIs and to have some sort of standardization across all of them, meaning that if you wanted to write a XR application once, you could be able to have it across all these different platforms. And it could be, in some sense, technology agnostic, where you could create an application and be able to, see it in a Windows mixed reality or Oculus technologies or, a Steam VR headset, whether it's like, Valve Index or, with HTC's latest headsets. So the Valve was really, creating something like Steam VR to be able to be compatible with the variety. And so in some sense, that was getting away from that part of only having things in a closed ecosystem. And if anything, a lot of people that get the Quest are able to play Steam VR applications on their PC, and that actually benefits having that openness. And some ways we've kind of already started to transcend out of what, say, like PSVR does with having a very closed ecosystem. How many different WebXR experiences can you do on PSVR? I don't even know if they have a browser or what kind of there's a lot more limitations into that. And so I see that Facebook, if anything, they've been kind of in this hybrid where they do want to have a lot of things that are closed walled garden, but they also have the Oculus browser, which is going to potentially be the biggest aspect in which that they're opening up to sort of the open metaverse. But they still are, in some ways wanting to control different aspects. So Neil Trevitt said, for every successful open standard, there's a proprietary competitor. And I think what I took away from that is sort of like this dialectic that we've been talking about in terms of these mutually exclusive dialectics between in one sense you have like the closed wall garden, which is, all these closed, DirectX as an example versus like the OpenGL or WebGL. So you have these graphics standards that are proprietary, but then they show you what's possible. So right now we're in VRChat, right? And you're able to have a very nice camera system and the ability of having a social graph and being able to have a high quality bar, right? Like VRChat is setting the bar for any type of experiences that we may want to have in WebXR. If we're in WebXR and we start to drop frames or we have other experiences, then, it may show us that there's limitations to the technology that still need to get up to parity what you can do with a native application. But at the same time, you may be able to go into WebXR experience and be able to send people a URL link and be able to kind of pull in data visualizations from another website or pull in tweets, or there may be integrations that you could do in a social VR experience that you could only do with the benefits of the open web. And so I think we're going to start to see that as we move forward, is starting to leverage the experiential dimensions of taking the 2D web and spatializing it within an immersive experience that you just can't have within VRChat. And that is going to create the, I had this discussion with Josh Carpenter, and he was talking about the extensible web manifesto, which is essentially trying to look at this dialectic tension between, say, iOS and Android is a good example. iOS is able to have this vertical integration where they have everything controlled from top to bottom. It's totally integrated, and you have a consistent user experience for everybody that uses iOS is going to have pretty much the same experience. That's not true in Android, because you have different hardware platforms and different decisions that, like, Samsung has different skins that they've been able to add all this other ways in which they want to do things. And the Android is there with the common operating system, but there's many different ways in which that each of these different hardware platforms have done that. And plus, there's different versions of Android, and there's like a huge amount of fragmentation in terms of different operating systems and inconsistencies even within the apps and experiences. So you look at the benefit of something like the Android operating system that is able to give you a baseline of a horizontal set of platforms, but more variance in terms of freedom that you can do with doing stuff that you can do on Android that you can never do on iOS because it's so locked down. But it's arguably a worse user experience because Apple has prioritized that user experience that has vertical integrated from hardware all the way top to down. It's like they're really embodying that closed walled garden. And so you can kind of think about it as these mutual exclusive dialectics of, like, what do you want to prioritize? Do you want to prioritize consistency of the user experience and be able to have safety control from privacy, or do you want freedom of a developer to be able to do whatever you want and to be able to have more messiness and experimentation and innovation that's happening within the Android? But Android doesn't have as much of a vibrant economy because it is arguably a worse experience, but also there's so many open source apps that the business model is more around advertising, which means that you end up having a lot more ad-driven apps that there may not even be a way to be able to buy it because the developer can make more money if they're getting the advertising. So you have even if you look at like Windows versus Mac or Linux, again, you have different trade-offs that you have. So just the same, Facebook is going to be developing the experience that we need to have those closed walled gardens because the Quest is able to achieve a quality experience that the OSVR, that's the open source version and the open hardware, basically failed because the experience was terrible. So you need to hit a certain quality bar. And eventually, once all of the manufacturing and engineering and all the best practices, once that catches up, I think you're going to start to see a parity of the open hardware systems or the open metaverse and the types of experiences you see in WebXR. And arguably, you'll be able to see stuff that goes way beyond what you're going to do with the closed walled garden. But I think, going back to sort of the Hegelian idea of these mutually exclusive dialectics, there's just going to be different trade-offs between decisions you have to make, and there's going to be some experiences that are better in the closed walled garden, and other experiences are going to be, way more freedom and way more experimentation, way more innovation. But I think it's important to have both. You can't have just one, which is, again, why I think the Epic versus Apple is so important, is because Apple is preventing a lot of these experiences because they're investing billions of dollars to create their platform, but yet they're creating these network dynamics that are creating entire economies that are sort of subservient to what they've created on their platform. And so, like we talked about before, the degrees of the Meriological nested context between the culture, the laws, the economy, and the technological architecture and code, you in some ways have like a microcosm of how the technological architecture and code within themselves creates its own, within that sort of a fractally nested, like underneath that ecosystem, they have their own laws, they have their own rules, they have their own economy that is preventing certain things from happening that Epic wants to be able to do, and they have a vision for what they want to create. But if Apple's approach is sort of precluding that, like, do they have the right because they've invested billions of dollars to do that? Or do we just need to, maybe Epic's going to lose the lawsuit and Apple's going to win, which means at that point you have to really put a lot of that investment into how do you create the economies of scale to create an open hardware movement that is able to essentially create the Linux of hardware and open hardware that is able to compete with something like the Apple version and the Facebook version and the Microsoft version and the Google version of all these technologies and the Snap and the TikTok. If they each come up with their own version, is there going to be a sort of open hardware and open operating system movement that is able to create that opposite of the dialectic? I think I don't expect to see a true viable open hardware movement until maybe 5 or 10 years. I think it's already starting, but depending on how the sort of larger political dynamics happen with some of these different lawsuits, is going to dictate whether or not if Apple loses and Epic wins, it's actually going to make it even less likely that we're going to see an open hardware movement. But open hardware, it could be that the economies of scale and the being able to do it sustainably, that may just be not viable to do that type of. You need new entities that are basically platform cooperatives to be able to operate and to make it make sense both financially, but also potentially ethically in terms of being in right relationship ethically sourced, and how you do, like, you have, it's very easy to do like distributed and open source software, not so much to do distributed and open hardware, because the constraints are so much more in terms of the economies of scale that you get with being able to operate at such a large scale that you do with these major corporations. But it's because of the dynamics of those economies of scale that we have basically 5 tech companies that are running the world, with the FANG. So I think that's where I see it, at least right now. We're going to see an open metaverse software-wise a lot sooner than we see the hardware-wise. There's already the movements that are happening. Even, tomorrow is going to be the WebXR Developer Summit that's being put on by the WebXR Awards. So you're starting to see the gathering of people, and you have the open metaverse initiative of a bunch of different people trying to come up with what are the open metaverse protocols that we want to be able to create a world that we want to live into, the open metaverse that we dream of in the science fiction. And is it require entities like Apple and Facebook to consider different aspects of the Open Metaverse Initiative and the different protocols they're using with, whether it's VRM as an open standard for avatars, or if they can basically just write it off because Facebook's like, you know what, we're not going to let you upload your avatar. You're using our avatar system because we want to have this as a consistent experience. We don't want sort of the messiness of the freedom that you get in something like VRChat. But by doing that, they get something else, which is more of a meritocracy of not creating maybe a dissonance between feeling like you don't have the expertise or the knowledge to be able to create this super fancy customized avatar. So, like I said, all of this about experiential design is kind of identifying what these different decisions that need to be made and what kind of trade-offs you have amongst those. And then for me, I think there's a challenge of how does that get translated into the direct experience. And then I think from my perspective, how those get translated is essentially a model of consciousness. So you get into the philosophy of mind. And so there's a way in which that I see virtual reality and all these exponential technologies as ways of directly being able to make decisions that create subtle changes and nuances in people's direct phenomenological experiences. And the more that you make those choices from an experiential design perspective, and the more that you're able to modulate consciousness, the more sophisticated that our language is going to become around our own phenomenological description of those experiences. Just like in wine tasting, I was talking to a neuroscientist that was talking about how people who have a very cultivated palate of being able to use language to describe their flavors of what their experience is, they have a more rich experience when they go in to taste wine, because when they taste the wine, it's activating all those parts in their brain that is using the language to describe the different categories that they've come up with, right? So part of coming up with a sophisticated palate as a wine taster is being able to distinguish the subtle nuances of flavors and experiences, where the challenge with wine tasting is that all the flavors are happening all at the same time, right? In order to discern the differences between it, you have to taste a lot of different wine. Just the same with experiential design. That's why I think it's a great metaphor, is because you have to go through a lot of different experiences and notice that across all these experiences, you have this same thing across that allows you to create a category that then allows you to come up with experiences, like ways of deciding, okay, and every experience that I've had that allows you to kind of like, have locomotion where I'm able to just, move through the world versus doing transportation. I've noticed that I have a larger consistent of having a coherent, embodied, and environmental presence that gives me a better mapping of a memory of this place when I'm moving through just movement, rather than when I teleport. It creates a disjunctive experience that maybe has a trade-off in terms of being more comfortable from a motion sickness perspective, but is ruining the spatial mapping that I'm having in the world, right? I'm able to sort of describe my experience of that because I've done, thousands of experiences where I have experiences of that. And just the same, part of what I see VR is going to be doing in terms of phenomenology is creating these immersive experiences that are creating subtle, nuanced shifts in people's phenomenological experiences. The more VR people do, the more they're going to be able to have a language to be able to describe their own experience and to describe it to other people. And then it's just going to allow people to have more of a fluency of being able to, like, oh yeah, you've done Beat Saber, when there's this time when you drop frames, or when you feel like you've been able to really hit the rhythm and it just is in synchrony and you just hit that flow state. We've all experienced that flow state where you just be able to kind of move without really thinking about it. It's like this ephemeral aspect of that flow state's a very specific phenomenological experience. And it's very specific to what that means within the context of Beat Saber, and how the scoring system is able to kind of like cultivate that type of experience. So yeah, but at the end of it, I think, is perhaps a more nuanced model of consciousness itself, which is that these experiential design frameworks, if they're sufficiently robust enough, will be able to generalize different aspects of different equivalence classes and different trade-offs that you're making, and in these different mutually exclusive dialectics. And there could be an infinite amount of those. So there could be, just like I said before, different philosophies that are saying, here's a feminist philosophy or decolonized philosophy, or just kind of like a phenomenologically driven approach to being able to do experiential design. That each of these different experiential design frameworks, at the end of it, end up being robust descriptions of consciousness itself, and then consciousness itself being able to maybe even do science around that, to be able to try to do more of a neurophenomenological integration of what are lived experiences for the phenomena of consciousness versus what's happening in our mind, and being able to measure all these different other aspects, and to be able to close the gap between our direct phenomenological experiences and what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, versus all the different neurological things that are happening in our body and our brain, and all the different things that we can measure with objective science, and to kind of fuse all these things together. So I do think that there is the potential to kind of really come up with some robust theories of consciousness by working within virtual reality.
That's a very interesting idea. I like the analogy with wine tasting, and that was sort of what I found myself when I started doing the PhD in VR, that I read a lot of papers and sort of didn't really almost have time to use VR, which is kind of ironic when you're trying to learn something about it, and was sort of why I started the YouTube channel, basically to force myself to check out experiences. And because you get this perspective on your preferences, what you like in virtual worlds, what you don't like, and eventually when people get that, and also what can you get outside of the Facebook walled garden, and people will create applications that are standing sort of in opposition towards that, like in the dialectic that you're talking about, and it will be this sort of conversation to and fro, where eventually we are discovering what this medium is. And I mean, Facebook is doing a lot for VR. So I also think that, I mean, I'm personally not I'm usually critical towards Facebook, but they do serve a very important role in this. And we are learning so much from where they're going and what we're going to see the next years. And eventually, it will be interesting to see when we do get to that point that you're mentioning, with like the adoption and see what metaverse we end up actually living in.
Yeah, the fact that they've invested so much money, and when they bought Oculus, that was a signal to the wider industry that this was fully baked to the point where it's ready to kind of, it got Google into it. It really catalyzed, at that point, Valve, according to History of the Future, they weren't really planning on creating their own, hardware. They were just going to, focus on the software. But then once Facebook bought Oculus, then I think the folks at Valve knew that we got to do our own hardware. If we're going to really make a software play, we have to have their own hardware, because they're not going to collaborate with us. It's just too high of a risk based upon the history of Facebook working with game developers. It's just they've got a storied history of kind of screwing over game developers over many, many years, and so they kind of like took that as a catalyst. And so that as a dialectic within itself, there was a lot of different ways in which Valve and Oculus were in collaboration in terms of looking at different things like tracking technologies and different approaches, and the external based with the lighthouse versus the computer vision approach. You can even see that even today that's a different approach where that's led to the Quest, and that's led to like full body tracking within stuff that you can do in VRChat there's no way you can do that yet within the Facebook approach, and they'll have to use some sort of external tracker in order to really fuse all these things together. And so just seeing how Facebook overall, though, I see has invested billions of dollars. They lost out on the mobile phone, and so they're motivated to really make a play at this, and they're really as Alex Heath has reported in information. He's now working at The Verge, but that there was nearly 20% of all the employees, like over nearly 10,000 of the 50,000 employees that work at Facebook are working on XR-related technology.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Reality, Facebook Reality Labs, that's 20% of their employees. And so just looking at where this is going, this is the next computing platform of virtual and augmented reality, XR generally, but spatial computing. And, Microsoft is making all of their moves, and Apple and Google is still working on augmented reality and taking more of a little bit of a software approach than hardware approach at this point. But, I expect them as well, if this really is going to be an next computing platform, that, you look at both the Quest and other entities like Magic Leap. Well, actually, I don't think Magic Leap was Android-based, but certainly the Oculus Quest is operating on Android. So there's still ways in which that the operating system layer, Facebook's working on their own operating system, but overall, Facebook has, at this point, progressed the whole industry more than they've harmed it. Now, the question is whether or not they decide to go down sort of the dark path of surveillance capitalism and doing things that are going to be violating aspects of our mental privacy and agency and identity. There's a lot of questions in which that, in hindsight, we may look at it of like, well, maybe it would have been better to go slower, to let this organically emerge rather than to have this infusion of capital that creates these needs and desires to kind of quickly figure out business models that are going to potentially bring more harm to collective society. That just like it was probably impossible to predict that, or to really fully know the risks of having something like social media be used for information warfare from state actors, and to be able to kind of potentially hijack elections by very much targeting a small group of 25,000 to 100,000 people to be able to shift the entire election in the course of history. That's the type of warfare that we have with information warfare that will eventually move into experiential warfare, moving into virtual and augmented reality technologies that are being weaponized by people who are trying to use rhetoric and to communicate certain messages. for their own benefit that are not for the benefit of the people that are watching it. So yeah, I mean, that we're living into we don't know, but what I'd say, the stuff that I come back to again and again is this, like even just thinking about information warfare and our reality bubbles, is that the more that I've dug into different aspects of epistemology and knowledge and truth and all these sort of philosophical approaches, is that this sort of dialectic that I talked about from Agnes Callard, where she talks about this, believing truths and avoiding falsehoods are actually two mutually exclusive algorithms that is impossible for you to do at the same time. You either end up having to preference one or the other. So if you're a skeptic, you'll preference avoiding falsehoods and kind of being just skeptical about any premise. Or if you are credulous and you have the will to believe, maybe you'll preference, believing it until you find evidence that is falsifying. But there's lots of different contextual dimensions of that. But I think generally people maybe have a temperamental balance between each of those. But to really notice that you as an individual can't produce knowledge without being in dialectic with other people in collaboration. If you have the will to believe, you have to be in dialectic with someone who has sort of more skeptical, and you have to be in a deliberative, collaborative process in order to produce knowledge, of working together to actually produce that knowledge, of working through and being open-minded to be able to transcend the limitations of your own view, but to be open to including other aspects, and to be able to create a synthesized third, sort of that synthesis of the Hegelian synthesis from the thesis and the antithesis. And so there's a certain amount of that pluralism, which means that you have to sit in the tension of the opposites, which means that you have to be comfortable with paradox.
Yeah.
Because if there's anything that we have right now in our society, is that we're sitting in the paradox. And I think so much we want to sort of collapse the complexity down into one view or the other. But, there's so many different polar extremes that are sort of in this dialectical relationship, where we have to really listen to, whether it's that from the freedom of being able to express our ideas versus the safety and security that we need to be able to have the boundaries that we need, or whether or not we want to preference free speech versus preference preventing harm from creating systems that are going to be unduly biased against intersectional identities, BIPOC or women or people of color or indigenous folks, all these different sort of intersectional identities that have oppression against them in different ways. All these different decisions we're making, the technology is being driven by the people who are making the technology and their own biases that they have, and these different trade-offs that they're showing. If people who are in a sort of monolithic background of cisgendered white males in technology, they might not be considering decisions that are bringing undue harm into women. A lot of the early experiences in social VR had no mitigating factors for harassment, right? And so once you realize that you need to have like personal space safety bubbles or ability to block people, in the absence of that, then you're creating environments that are preferencing people who don't have problems with harassment, or that it doesn't bother them, or whatever. But if people who have trauma and PTSD and feel like the virtual experiences are have this intrusive experiences, that without having those safety experiences within these different social VR experiences, then you're creating technology that's going to be biased against those particular people. And all technology is going to have some bias because of this sort of mutually exclusive design trade-offs. You always have to, you can't be everything. You can't create an experience that's going to be perfect for everybody. There's going to be different ways that you have to make these compromises, and to have as many different diverse experiences as you can. But I think that's the challenge, is try to move forward in the industry that is trying to find these processes to try to navigate to make sure that this is developed in the most equitable ways we possibly can, and to hear from all these different perspectives and voices to try to address these issues in a way that there's already a disparity of people who have access to the technology, right?
Yeah.
As it gets into the hands of people, then all of a sudden, we've created an entire infrastructure that's already going to be not really paying attention to your needs because we haven't been able to hear your voice because you haven't had access to the it's sort of like all these sort of self-reinforcing things. So anyway, just as we move forward, recognizing that we have to be comfortable with these paradoxes and these tensions of the opposites, and to be willing to be able to sit with people with different perspectives and different points of view, and to really to listen to those things that we're not seeing or not including, because yeah, we want to be as inclusive as we can, and that's a process. But at the same time, it's there's value, and one individual saying, I'm just going to create an experience that is going to make these polarized trade-offs, and I think that's why we need to have as many different diverse experiences as we can, because there's no one monolith that's going to be able to solve all those. And I think that if there's anything that we've seen is that we have these different technology platforms that are kind of like these monolithic experiences that are making these mutually exclusive trade-offs that then are preferencing, like whether it's the in Myanmar, creating experiences on social media that is fostering a genocide against a certain people. So if there's kind of a colonial nature of having entities that are basically taking control around the world without diverse alternatives, then you create situations like that, which is why it's so important to have a plurality of different experiences and different trade-offs and more decolonized perspectives of really looking at regional perspectives of what's going to be really important for specific communities, so that it's able to, for each of those different communities, that they're able to make those decisions for themselves, rather than having this sort of entity that comes in and starts to make those experiences for them. So you have this risk of the colonial nature of what we've had in the past replicating itself through these virtual technologies, by only having Facebook being able to make the decision as to the content moderation, as an example, and having no peer-driven way of being able to do that, and having ways in which that there's the culture and the values of one company that's in control of 2.6 billion people. That's where you start to see the risks of the consolidation and all these other sort of externalized problems that come about that. The antidote is potentially ways in which that people can take more ownership over that. But that gets back to this whole dimension of who owns the technology stack and whether or not they're able to do that. So yeah, I think it's you can already see philosophically there's going to be issues, right? Just looking at this sort of looking at the limitations of one singular perspective, the mutually exclusive dialectics, and having big companies having too much power. You already see that's going to bring issues. How to have antidotes to that, whether it's antitrust or having people have more freedom, that's where it gets a little bit more tricky. But yeah, I think, I don't know, overall, philosophically, there's so many interesting problems that VR is introducing, because we get to talk about these things because they haven't happened yet.
Yeah.
But we kind of like the philosophy allows us to have a spotlight to say, okay, we understand some of these different underlying dimensions of how things are going to play out. We already can see that there's going to be issues here. How can we sort of work out some of these problems that we already know are going to happen, and we maybe even have some evidence of that? So are there ways to prevent the harms from being done before it actually happens? Or should you just like put it out into the world, see what happens, and then react to it, which is what we've always done. But then there may be things that you're doing that brings undue harm that is irreversible. And I think that's the challenge, is to know at what point do you intervene and try to prevent the harms from being done, versus from just putting it out there and seeing what happens, and then learning and adapting. And if there's no sort of oversight mechanism or stopgap to say, oh, hey, wait, push the stop red button, we need to sort of like, turn this back or shut this down or, slow it down. When once it launches, you have all the mechanisms of just grow. But in that, you may be sort of amplifying issues at a scale that, starts to bring shifts in culture that, is replicating what we've already started to see in the realm of social media. We can already imagine that's going to start, once VR is at scale, we're going to see some of those same issues, but it's going to be even more complicated in the sense that it's not something you can look back on and look at what was written in a text or an image. Right. It's going to be a conversation that happened, but then at that point, does that mean that every single conversation that happens in these immersive spaces is always recorded that they can look back on, and that sort of threatens our freedom of assembly and ability to be able to freely connect to people and to have our right to privacy in a way that, if it's recorded by Facebook, that means the government can have access to it. All of a sudden that changes the aspect of the Fourth Amendment, which means that what we say or do to anybody in these virtual spaces, the government can have access to that, and that is basically into the government's hands that they can start to then do stuff with. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways in which that as we move forward, trying to really live into the ultimate potential, but also recognize that for every good thing, there's going to be sort of unintended consequences that we can't even imagine right now. But we know that are going to be introducing problems that are even more complicated than the problems that VR is solving.
Yeah, for sure. It will get super complicated. I think, well, first of all, thanks for having this conversation. It's been super interesting. I think I want to end this with a question that you may be familiar with, adopting your style here. So, what do you think is the future potential of XR technologies?
Well, we've talked a lot of different philosophical aspects, and just sort of to kind of lean on that. I think from a phenomenological perspective, VR has the ability to allow you to understand yourself better, to understand other people better, to be more connected to the world around us, and especially to the earth itself, as well as to all these other concepts and ideas and sort of all domains of reality and the different perspectives that are kind of go beyond our own worldviews. So, connecting to self, to other, to the world, and to everything. So that at the heart of it, I think is what I come back to. Now, but I also think that VR represents a paradigm shift in terms of moving into more of this process relational reality that I think as you go into VR, you have a direct experience of, there's nothing, the only thing that's sort of physical in our experiences that are mediated into this virtual right now are our physical bodies, the world around us, and all the sort of physical technology that we're using. Other than that, we're in kind of like a platonic realm of ideal forms where we're able to have this experiential layer where there's ways that there could be music, there could be other ways of using these shapes that are around us to evoke different feelings, the way that the color is being used and the lighting, and all sorts of ways that you could start to modulate our different qualities of presence, of our mental and social presence, our embodied presence and environmental presence, our active presence and ways that we express our agency, as well as our emotional presence. But there's ways of also exploring the context of different contexts of being able to understand the ways that our life and our identities are spread out across different contexts. And as we go across these different contexts, we start to see different aspects of our identity that is context dependent across these different contexts, and really understand who we are when we're a student, who we are when we're in a romantic partnership, who we are when we're around our family. There could be parts of our character that are universal across all these different contexts and all these different qualities of experience and how we express our courage or curiosity or ways of expressing our will or just temperance or or the five sins, or ways in which that our ability of our character is revealed through these different contexts. And we're able to really understand parts of our own essential character. And then the stories that were involved, we're able to understand other people's stories, but to be able to understand our own stories as they involve. So as I've been answering this question, I've been going through the qualities of experiences, the context of the experiences, the character experiences, and the story of the experience. And, on the whole, I think as we sort of, get into these flow states, in these different moments of synchronicity, and being able to kind of connect to people from you're across the world, and we're able to kind of sit down as if we're having this experience, this conversation. Like how many other people in the world are really into VR and philosophy? Well, we can sort of start to create our own culture, our own ways of communicating, our own ideas, and create worlds that express that culture, and from that create cultures of people that are able to also be a part of that and who are able to participate and be a co-creative participant in that culture. And so I think part of this shift from substance metaphysics to process relational metaphysics is part of what Alex McDowell talks about from the history of storytelling, where he shows this graph where in the past storytelling used to be a part of a communal experience where myths would be told, but in the process of telling the myth, people would add their own music, they would add their own culture, they would add in. It was very a participatory process. Myths eventually got written down, but they were evolving. They were evolving with the culture, and so they were alive, and they became a part of how the culture evolved is how the stories were changing and evolving as those same stories were being told. We still have that to some extent for the ways that we retell stories at different times and recontextualize them. But once linearized media came in with the printing press and all this way to kind of concretize the written word, linearize it, or create the canonical version of a movie, there's some ways in which that storytelling process was authored by sort of the outside canonical version, right?
Yeah.
And it became less participatory and more like you're consuming the story. But I think, since the turn of the century of film and moving from maybe the written word that was more linear into more the image, we moved from word to image. And so we're still in that transition of maybe we were 500-year cycle of the linear image. Now we're maybe in a 500-year cycle of both, or the 500-year of the linear word and text and the printing press. The turn of the century, we're moving from the written culture into a visual culture. And in that visual culture, we're also moving into computing technologies as being the printing press of this era. And in the computing technologies that happened in the 60s, and really kind of going to the mainstream, going from consumer available enterprise and what we've seen with the personal computer as well as with the video game systems, we're moving more into a realm where it's more interactive and participatory and agile, and we're able to use our own expression of our will and our ability of expressing our agency. It's starting through the video games and pushing buttons, but eventually, with virtual and augmented reality, that expression of the will is going to be more higher bandwidth with our being able to express our body and our embodiment and the way that we speak and what we say and our ideas, and that the ideas of collective storytelling are moving into this more collaborative, participatory, living story worlds where, it's the immersive theater where you're actually able to kind of break out of the fourth wall frame and you're able to kind of like become a part of that story. And when I talk about Robert McKee quote, the Robert McKee quote is, when you talk about stories are all about these characters that are making these decisions under pressure. And the more intense the pressure, the more that the part of their essential character is being revealed. Well, when you watch a movie and you're passively receiving it, it's more about you learning about someone else's character and how they've developed their character. And they're going through these different, artificially, these intense situations and having to make these choices. And you're learning about the character of an individual or a person, place, or thing, whatever you're looking at, either in a novel or in a film. But in this interactive media, video games and virtual reality and augmented reality, we're appearing ourselves as the protagonists of the stories. And as we're being put under these positions of power or these pressured situation of these different contexts, we're learning about our own sense of our character across these different contexts, across these different qualities of presence, across how our own story is evolving and unfolding over time. And so that we're able to see sort of a trajectory of our own story and how there's a process relational dimension of how this experience is great for us right now. But if we have the same experience next week, it might be different. It will be different. You can't step in the same river twice, as Heraclitus said. So noticing that, like, there's the quality of the experience versus the quantity of the experience. And so there's the Greeks had two words for the quality of time. There's the chronos and the kairos. And the chronos is like the quantification, the objectification of the experience, and then the kairos of the moment is the quality of the moment. So I think that we're going to be starting to tune into the quality of moment of the time. And then the Whitehead's idea of this concrescence, the concrescence of many things that are kind of evolving all at the same time. And this concrescence is actually happening at the galactic scale, that literally from the smallest scale to the galactic scale, that the universe is unfolding in this dynamic process, and that our participation is actually changing the course of how the universe is unfolding, both at the micro scale of our own worlds, but also potentially at the biggest scale possible. This idea of concrescence and this sort of fractal holographic nature of having the world kind of contained within us at this mereological scale, from the smallest scale to the largest scales. And so noticing how there's going to be the quality of the moment and living into this way in which that trusting people's intuition and trusting that there's more than just the, objectification of the world, but like going back to this pluralistic approach of multiple ontologies and multiple ways of knowing.
Yeah.
And realizing that we're each going to have to find our own orientation around which ways of knowing we preference, whether it's, like Clifford, you're preferencing avoiding believing falsehoods. And so you're the sort of, the archetypal skeptic and someone who's constantly questioning what we really know and, advocating for the suspension of judgment. Or if you have the will to believe and sort of really diving into sort of more esoteric or mystical interpretations of reality. But that, each of these different philosophies are going to have different lenses that are both revealing different aspects of reality, but also occluding different aspects of reality. And that what's really important is that you're in dialogue with these many different perspectives of multiple ontologies, multiple perspectives, and that you're able to get more of a nuanced perspective, and that it's able to potentially produce knowledge across all these different perspectives in a way that we're in collaboration with each other, where we're not holding too tightly into our own beliefs or own worldviews, but we're able to kind of participate in this dialectical process that is in this collaboration of believing truths and avoiding falsehoods and understanding the nature of reality and talking about all these different subtle nuances of experience. So, I mean, I really do see that there's a lot of philosophical implications, but it's really up to the culture in terms of our intention for what we want to get out of this. It's not, that's one intention for what could come out of it, but there's going to be lots of other competing stakeholders going to have other ideas for what they want to get for different reasons. And that's just going to be just like the internet is today in the World Wide Web, and it's just like all of reality. So I'm hoping that we're able to replicate some of the benefits of all that, but also to use the affordances of VR to kind of transcend a lot of that, but also just to open people's minds up and not to be so fixed in a dogmatic way into one way of believing, but to sort of be open-minded and to be comfortable into sitting into that paradox and to sending the tension of the opposites of those polarities of those mutually exclusive dialectics as we are allowing ourselves to kind of transcend the limitations of our own worldview, to be able to take the benefits of each of those, but also to be able to listen to other perspectives and other worldviews, and to translate each of those philosophies into whole experiential design frameworks and worlds that you're able to go into a world of process relational ontology, go into the Buddhist perspective, go into the Confucianist or the Taoist,
that's super interesting.
to go into a world that has at every layer of how the world is created, driven by a deep philosophical orientation for why they created the world that they created. The world that we're in right now is created by 101 and SCRN. Skern 101 passed away, but there's a lot of these shaders that are kind of going beyond the constraints of what you do with 2D objects, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to come into this world, is because this world itself, the Treehouse of the Shade itself, there's a whole sense of different buttons there that you can start to push and see different ways of looking at ways that you can modulate space and time that go beyond a substance metaphysics orientation, but use shaders and mathematics to be able to describe the unfolding process of reality. So that's a big reason why I wanted to be in this world, to be able to talk about this, because of all the different worlds that I've found, this world matches my own sort of inclinations philosophically the most. And I just, it's a beautiful world, and it, 1001 left us too soon, but I'd encourage anybody to come into this VRChat world and play around with these different places and to really meditate on a lot of these different ideas, and to come up with your own philosophy, and to have a really fixed idea and go create a world that is really driven by that. One creator that has done that is Anton Hand, what he's been doing with the horseshoes, hand grenades, and I forget the H. That his and hot dogs, horseshoes, and hand grenades. He's very philosophically driven and created a whole world around that. And so and Andrea Katsukaru, another creator who's very driven by philosophy and her phenomenological philosophical ideas, and driven by maybe a little bit more Daniel Dennett and kind of ideas of that all of consciousness is an illusion, so why not try to create phenomenological experiences that are modulating it? But that leads her down a path to think about ways
Mm.
of VR that is just way different than most people.
Yeah.
So I hope that over time that people start to learn about different philosophical approaches, and then they pick their horse for what they really resonate with, and they go out and they create an experience that is extremely driven by those philosophical concepts. So yeah, that's what I see the potential is, and yeah, maybe at some point there'll be things that come from our direct embodied experiences that we understand about the nature of reality that will feed into philosophy. Because I think if there's anything that has been holding philosophy back is the lack of these embodied experiences about a lot of these concepts and ideas, especially around phenomenology, or whether it's the nature of reality or whatever that ends up being. This emphasis of substance metaphysics, I think over time is going to become weaker and weaker as people maybe see that there's more of a process relational dimension and more experiential dimension, phenomenological dimension of our nature of our experiences and our nature of reality. And maybe that'll lead them to some of these other philosophical traditions that have been exploring these different concepts. So but at the same time, I'm also happy saying that all of the different ideas have already been thought of, and it's just a big giant remix, and that we're not going to have any novel philosophical insights out of VR. That if anything, there's maybe sociological dimensions within these communities that need to be shifted through whether it's a range of psychedelic experiences or virtual augmented reality experiences. But I do expect that the shift from 2D to 3D is going to give people embodied experiences that, from an embodied cognition perspective, is going to allow them to reference a whole body of knowledge and experiences that will eventually inform the philosophies that become the mainstream, and that we're in the midst of a philosophical crisis right now where we need to get beyond substance metaphysics and physicalism and materialism and a lot of the limitations of thinking about the world through the lens of a static concrete object and the language that we use to describe it as these static concrete objects, and to look at it from these process relational lenses, and that to get into this more ecological perspective and not just into the individual as an individual, and sort of this Western liberal idea of us as these moral individuals, but also as moral collectives that are in relationship in these ecological dynamics. And again, that's why I go back to Whitehead and his influence of Whitehead and process relational philosophy in the ecological and environmental movements. There's quite a history there in terms of how that type of ecological thinking that has come from that more process relational metaphysics that really tends to think of the nature of reality as we are who we are by who we are in relationship with. And when we really start to think about that, we start to see our experiences and who we are relationship, and this sort of networked identity and relational self. This interview I did with Lewis Gordon, who is very influenced by this process relational ontologies and metaphysics, and looking at identity through the process relational way, looking at privacy through process relational lenses, and looking at the nature of reality itself and our own experience through the ways in which that we're in relationship and right relationship to not only ourselves, to other people, to the world, and to all dimensions of reality.
Yeah, for sure. I really enjoy what you're saying about embodying a philosophy in the virtual world, and I mean, like the ultimate potential of VR to reframe the way that we view our own ways of thinking about the world and sharing ideas in that way, gaining new perspectives. That's I really agree. I think there is a lot of potential in VR to do exactly that, and for that again to inform the ways that we think about it and to have that reframed again, and that's super interesting. Thanks a lot, Kent, for joining me. This was a super interesting conversation, and I can recommend to everyone, if you would like to stay up to date on what's happening in the XR space, then definitely follow Kent By on Twitter, and of course also the Voices of VR podcast. It's really a great resource, and thanks for everything that you're doing for XR.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. And I know we've been wanting to have this conversation for a while. I think we had it just at the right time after you've done your whole paper on postphenomenology.
Yeah.
I would love to see like I'm not convinced that I would sort of move over to that. I think it's maybe revealing different process relational perspectives, and I would encourage over time to sort of incorporate some of these other ideas from Whitehead and process relational thinking, and see how that can sort of be expanded out into, even at the metaphysics layer of this process relational ontology, like metaphysics as a basis of reality. Because I do think it's a very powerful framework, and I just look forward to having more discussions in the wider
Yeah.
community about a lot of these things. And I just thank you for holding this space and to really, having a lot of these different thinkers and discussions. And yeah, and also just, I'm very philosophically driven. So to kind of like sit down and have a conversation, I think is I'm able to kind of speak in a language that allows me to really articulate what really drives me and motivates me, because it's a lot of these deep open questions that what is the nature of reality, what's the nature of consciousness, who are we, why are we here, a lot of these existential questions, and these open questions that go through math and science and philosophy, that and then the epistemology and knowledge and truth, and the nature of knowledge, and how does VR change all that. Very much thinking about all those things, and very much drives a lot of what I do. And so I would just encourage the wider community to start to have more discussions about these and have more critical discourse. And if there's anything anybody disagrees with me on any of these things, I'd love to sort of engage in a conversation and really engage in that dialectic, because I think that's where I get the most excited, is being into these discussions with two opposing polarities that have opposite points of view, and really having a debate to really kind of explore some of these different concepts and ideas. So yeah, thanks for holding this space. And yeah, I just really encourage you to continue to do that. And I look forward to seeing where this all goes.
My pleasure. Me too. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye, YouTube.